A 14-year-old boy stands barefoot in the snow outside a biker garage at 3 in the morning. His hands are black with grease. His eyes are older than his bones. He has just uncovered a sabotage that sent his father to prison, and the man who did it works for the city. Tonight, the Steel Reapers will have to decide: protect this kid and declare war on the most powerful man in the county, or turn him away and let the system crush another innocent life. But here's the thing. Curtis Vale, the president of this club, hasn't spoken to his own daughter in 6 years. He can barely keep himself alive. And he's about to become the only thing standing between this boy and the people who want him silenced. This story will test everything you think you know about loyalty, fatherhood, and what it means to protect someone when the whole world has already given up on them. Stay with me until the very end. If this one hits you, drop a like, leave a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Let's ride. Part 1. The snow came sideways that night, not the kind that drifts soft and quiet like something out of a postcard. This was Great Plains snow, horizontal, mean, sharp as broken glass against bare skin, the kind of snow that buries cattle standing up and makes the highway disappear like it never existed in the first place. Route 9 outside Harlan, Nebraska, had been swallowed whole by midnight. The road crews had given up around 11. The state police shut down the northbound lanes an hour later, and by 1 in the morning, the only light still burning in the entire stretch of frozen, nothing between Lincoln and the South Dakota border, was the neon flicker of a dying Sinclair Diner sign, and the pale glow leaking through the windows of a corrugated steel building set back from the road behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The sign above the gate read, "Vale Iron Works." Underneath it, in smaller letters that had been painted over twice and still bled through, "Steel Reapers MC." Inside, the garage smelled like diesel, old coffee, and the kind of cold that seeps through concrete walls, no matter how high you crank the space heaters. Curtis Vale sat alone at the workbench near the back, a filterless cigarette burning low between the second and third fingers of his right hand. The hand was missing the tip of the ring finger, lost to a lathe accident in 2004 or a bar fight in Reno in 2006, depending on which version he felt like telling. His face was 53 years of weather and regret carved into leather, deep lines around the mouth, a scar that ran from his left ear down to the jaw where a piece of shrapnel had kissed him outside Fallujah in 2003. Gray in the beard now, more than he liked. Eyes the color of used motor oil, dark, flat, and hard to read. The radio on the shelf behind him was playing Howlin' Wolf through a speaker that had been cracked since last winter. The blues came through broken, tinny, half swallowed by static, but Curtis didn't care. He wasn't listening. He was staring at the phone on the bench in front of him. 3 missed calls from a number he hadn't dialed in 6 years. Lena, his daughter. He picked up the cigarette, set it down, picked it up again. The ember trembled. Curtis Vale had ridden through firefights in Iraq, done 11 months in county for assault, buried his wife alone in a rainstorm because nobody from her family would stand next to a man in a leather vest at a funeral, and once drove his Harley 97 miles with 2 cracked ribs and a collapsed lung just to make a court date that his lawyer forgot to cancel. He was not a man who trembled. But that phone made his hands shake. He didn't call back. He never did. The power went out at 1:47 a.m. Not with a bang. Not with the usual pop and hum down of an overloaded generator kicking off in a storm. This was different. This was clean. 1 second, the fluorescent tubes were buzzing overhead and the space heaters were rattling against the cold, and the next second, nothing. Pure black. Pure silence. The kind that makes the air feel heavier, like the dark itself has weight. Curtis didn't move. He'd been in enough bad situations to know that the first man who moves in the dark is the first man who dies. Somewhere across the garage, he heard Roach, 260 pounds of ex-Marine with a titanium plate in his skull and a voice like gravel in a blender, stop mid-sentence. Heard the creak of a stool as Dex stood up slowly near the front bay. Heard the soft click of a knife being opened, though he couldn't tell by who. Nobody spoke. The storm howled outside like something wounded and furious, and inside the garage, 6 grown men sat in absolute darkness and waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 90 seconds. Then, From the back of the building, near the generator shed, a sound. Metal on metal, light, precise. Not the bang and clatter of someone breaking in, more like someone working, someone who knew what they were doing. Curtis was on his feet before the second sound came. He moved through the dark by memory. 4 steps past the workbench, left at the tool rack, straight through the narrow hall that led to the back bay where the industrial generator sat behind a steel-reinforced door. His boots were silent on the concrete. His right hand found the flashlight on the shelf where it always was. He didn't turn it on yet. The sound came again, a soft metallic click, then a hum. Low, building, the generator coughing back to life like a drowning man finding air. Curtis flicked the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark and landed on a boy. 14, maybe. Small-framed. Barefoot on the frozen concrete, which was insane. It was 9 degrees outside, and the floor in the generator room was cold enough to burn skin. He was wearing a faded Metallica shirt that hung off one shoulder like it belonged to someone twice his size, and jeans so thin at the knees they were almost translucent. His hands were black with grease up to the wrists. His fingernails were cracked. His hair was matted, dark, unwashed, falling across a face that was sharp-boned and hollow-cheeked in a way that only comes from weeks of not eating enough. He was crouched beside the open panel of the generator, and he had already reconnected the neutral line. The boy didn't look up when the light hit him, didn't flinch, didn't run. He just kept working, fingers moving with a precision that made Curtis's chest tighten for reasons he couldn't name. "I fixed it," the boy said quietly. His voice was flat, steady. The voice of someone who had stopped expecting kindness a long time ago. But somebody wanted it to fail. Curtis didn't lower the flashlight. Behind him he could hear Roach and Dex coming down the hallway, boots heavy, breathing rough. He held up his left hand without looking back. "Stop." They stopped. "What's your name, kid?" The boy finally looked up. His eyes were pale gray, almost colorless in the flashlight beam, and they had that look, that 1,000-yard stare Curtis had seen in men twice his age coming off their 3rd deployment. The look of someone who had seen something that couldn't be unseen and had stopped trying to pretend otherwise. "Elias?" the boy said. "Elias Mercer." Curtis felt the name land in his gut like a fist. Mercer. He knew that name. Every biker in Harlan County knew that name. Tom Mercer, journeyman electrician, union guy, 3rd generation. The man who'd been convicted 3 years ago for the warehouse fire on Calhoun Street that killed 2 city inspectors and destroyed $1, $2 million worth of municipal electrical equipment. The fire that the prosecution said was arson. The fire that the defense said was a system failure caused by years of deferred maintenance and corrupt inspection shortcuts. The fire that sent a 41-year-old father of one to Tecumseh State Correctional for 12 to 20 years. The trial had been fast. The evidence had been clean. Too clean, some people said. But nobody with any power said it, so it didn't matter. Tom Mercer was in prison, and his son was barefoot in a biker garage at 2 a.m. fixing a generator that someone had sabotaged. Curtis lowered the flashlight 2 inches. Not all the way, just enough to take the glare off the kid's face. "You said somebody wanted it to fail," Curtis said slowly. "Explain." Elias reached into the open panel and pulled out a section of wire. He held it up, and even in the uneven beam of the flashlight, Curtis could see it. The cut was clean. Surgical. Not frayed from wear or heat damage. Someone had sliced the neutral line at a precise point where the failure wouldn't be immediate. It would build. An hour, maybe 2. A slow overload that would look exactly like a storm-related outage to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. "Delayed overload," Elias said, turning the wire in his fingers. "You cut the neutral at the junction point, and the system redistributes the load unevenly across the phases. It doesn't blow right away. It cooks. Slow. By the time the breaker trips, the damage looks like weather. Nobody checks twice." The garage was silent except for the wind and the rebuilt hum of the generator. Roach spoke first from the dark hallway behind Curtis. "How old are you?" 14. "How the hell do you know all that?" Elias set the wire down on the concrete. He wiped his hands on his jeans slowly, carefully, like the grease was something he was used to carrying. "Because it's the same method they used on Calhoun Street," he said. "The same exact one. Cut neutral. Delayed overload. Clean failure." He looked at Curtis again. And this time there was something behind those pale eyes. Not fear, not anger, but something older than both. Something that had been sitting in this kid's chest for 3 years, rotting, waiting. It's how they framed my dad. Nobody moved. The wind screamed against the metal walls of the garage. Curtis Vale had spent 20 years telling himself he wasn't a man who got involved. He paid his taxes when he remembered. He kept the club clean. No hard drugs, no trafficking, nothing that brought federal heat. He ran the ironworks shop legitimate mostly. He helped vets when he could, which wasn't often enough. He voted in local elections, but not national ones, because he'd stopped believing the big machine could be moved by men like him. He had his rules, his lines, his small careful life inside a chain-link fence with razor wire on top. And now a barefoot kid was standing in his generator room telling him that the same sabotage pattern that destroyed a man's life 3 years ago had just been used on his garage tonight. Which meant someone was watching. Which meant someone knew the boy was here. Which meant this was already bigger than a broken generator. Curtis turned to Roach, locked the gate. Nobody in or out until morning. Roach didn't ask why. He just moved. 260 pounds of ex-Marine disappearing down the dark hallway with a purpose that made the floor vibrate. Curtis looked at Dex. Get the kid something to eat. Boots, too, if we've got any that'll fit. Dex, tall, quiet, a recovering addict with steady hands and sad eyes who'd been sober for 11 months and counting, nodded once and headed toward the kitchen without a word. Curtis looked back at Elias. The boy was shaking. Not from cold, though the cold was savage enough. He was shaking the way people shake when they've been holding something inside for so long that the muscles have forgotten how to relax. A fine, constant tremor running through his shoulders and down into his grease-black fingers. "How long you been out there?" Curtis asked. "Since yesterday." "Yesterday, in this storm. I walked from the group home on Pratt." Curtis did the math. The Pratt Street group home was 11 miles from the garage. 11 miles in sub-zero wind with no shoes in a blizzard. He wanted to ask why. He wanted to ask how. He wanted to ask what kind of system lets a 14-year-old boy walk 11 miles barefoot through a storm and nobody picks up a phone. But he already knew the answer to all of those questions, and the answer was the same one it had always been. The system doesn't care. The system was never designed to care. It was designed to process, to file, to move bodies from one box to another and call it care because the paperwork said so. "Why here?" Curtis asked instead. Elias met his eyes. "Because my dad said if anything ever went wrong, really wrong, I should find the Steel Reapers." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Curtis had heard in years. Tom Mercer had never been a member of the club. He'd been adjacent, a guy who showed up at the annual Veterans Rally, who fixed bikes on the side for extra cash, who drank with some of the older members on Friday nights at the Elkhorn Bar. A peripheral man. Quiet. Dependable. The kind of man who showed up when he said he would and never asked for anything in return. Curtis had liked him. Not close friend liked him, but respected him the way you respect a man who works hard and doesn't complain and looks you in the eye when he talks. He'd heard about the arrest, heard about the trial, thought it smelled wrong but didn't dig because digging meant trouble and trouble meant heat, and heat meant risk to the club, and the club always came first. That's what he told himself. Standing in the generator room at 2 a.m, looking at Tom Mercer's barefoot son, the excuse felt thinner than paper. "All right," Curtis said. He didn't say it loud. He didn't say it with conviction. He said it the way a man says a word when he knows it's going to cost him everything and he's too tired to pretend otherwise. "All right, come inside." He turned and walked back toward the main garage. He didn't check to see if Elias followed. He knew the kid would. That was the thing about people who had run out of options. They didn't hesitate when someone finally opened a door. They just walked through it and prayed the floor on the other side was solid. The main room of the garage was coming back to life slowly. The overhead fluorescents flickered on one by one, each one buzzing and popping like they resented being woken up. The space heaters coughed back into their rattling hum. Roach was at the front gate, visible through the grease-smeared window, his massive frame silhouetted against the snow. Dex was in the kitchen. Curtis could hear a can opener in the microwave. 2 other members, Stitch and Harlow, were emerging from the back rooms where they'd been sleeping, rubbing their eyes, pulling on boots, reading the room with the practiced alertness of men who had learned a long time ago that midnight disruptions were rarely good news. Curtis pointed to a chair near the workbench. "Sit." Elias sat. He held his hands in his lap. They were still shaking. Dex came out of the kitchen with a bowl of canned soup and a pair of work boots that were at least 2 sizes too big but had wool liners and intact soles. Elias looked at the soup like he'd forgotten what hot food looked like. He picked up the spoon carefully, as if it might be taken away. Nobody spoke while the boy ate. That was a rule that didn't need stating. You don't talk to a starving person while they're eating, you let them have that. Curtis lit another cigarette and leaned against the workbench. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He already knew who it was. He didn't check. Stitch, a former army medic with a gray ponytail and permanent circles under his eyes, sat down across from Elias. He watched the boy eat with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who'd spent years triaging bodies in the field. "Frostbite on the left foot," Stitch said quietly to Curtis, without looking away from the boy. "Mild, treatable, malnutrition. Hasn't slept in days by the look of it." "What about the group home?" "If they let him walk 11 miles in this, the group home's either negligent or somebody paid them to look the other way." Curtis dragged on the cigarette. The ember flared orange in the dim garage light. Outside, the storm was still howling, and somewhere beneath it, the low growl of Harley engines idling in the cold. Roach had started the bikes near the gate, the exhaust cutting warm clouds into the freezing air. A habit from the old days when they used the engine heat to keep the pipes from cracking in deep winter. "Kid," Curtis said after Elias had finished the soup and set the bowl down with both hands wrapped around it like he was holding on to something precious. "I need you to tell me everything." Elias looked at him. Those pale gray eyes steady now, the shaking in his hands gone or buried deep enough to hide. "Everything?" "Everything." Elias reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, like it was the most valuable thing he owned, which it probably was. It was a hand-drawn electrical diagram. Not a kid's scribble, not a rough sketch. This was precise, clean lines, proper symbols, labeled junction points, load calculations written in a tight, cramped hand that was barely legible but technically accurate. Curtis had been around enough electricians and mechanics in his life to know the difference between someone who understood systems and someone who was faking it. This kid understood systems. "My dad drew these before the trial," Elias said. "He sent them to his lawyer. The lawyer never submitted them as evidence." He laid the diagram flat on the workbench under the fluorescent light. "This is the Calhoun Street warehouse circuit. See here." He pointed to a junction point near the top of the diagram. "Neutral line. Cut here, the load redistributes. Phase 1 takes 60%. Phase 2 takes 40%. The imbalance builds heat in the transformer. Slow, 6 hours, maybe 8. Then it trips, and the arc flash ignites whatever's closest." He looked up at Curtis. "That's not arson. That's sabotage. And it's the exact same thing that was done to your generator tonight." Stitch leaned forward. "Same method. Same method, same cut point, same timing principle." Harlow, a thick-necked man with a shaved head and a voice like rusted steel, spoke from the doorway where he'd been standing with his arms crossed. "Who'd sabotage our generator?" Elias didn't answer immediately. He folded the diagram carefully and held it in his lap. "The same person who sabotaged the warehouse," he said finally. "The same person who testified against my dad at trial. The same person who made sure the lawyer never filed those diagrams as evidence." Curtis's cigarette had burned down to the filter. He didn't notice. "Who?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive. Elias looked at him. "Dalton Rusk." The name hit the room like a dropped engine block. Every man in the garage knew that name. Dalton Rusk had been a Steel Reaper once, 20 years ago, before Curtis was president, back when the club was rougher and looser, and the line between outlaw and criminal was thinner than a razor's edge. Rusk had ridden with the club for 3 years before he got smart, got clean, and got out. Went straight, got a degree in urban planning, climbed the city ladder with the kind of steady, patient ambition that made people forget where he came from. Now he was Harlan County's infrastructure officer. The man who signed off on building permits, electrical inspections, road contracts. The man who decided which projects got funded and which ones didn't. The man who, 3 years ago, had sat in a courtroom and testified that Tom Mercer had been seen near the Calhoun Street warehouse the night of the fire and had expressed frustration with city inspection protocols. That testimony had been the nail in the coffin. And now his son was sitting in the Steel Reaper's garage saying Rusk was behind all of it. Curtis crushed the dead cigarette in the ashtray and looked at Elias for a long time. The boy held his gaze without flinching. 14 years old, and he had the stillness of a man who had already fought his worst battle and lost, and was now just waiting to see if the world would give him one more chance to fight again. "You got proof?" Curtis asked. "I have the diagrams, I have the pattern, and I have something else." "What?" Elias reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small battered USB drive. 3 weeks ago, I broke into the county records office on 4th Street. The window in the basement bathroom doesn't lock. I copied everything I could find on the Calhoun Street project. He set the USB drive on the workbench next to the diagram. Inspection reports, contract amendments, payment records. There's a company called Gray Line Solutions that received $340,000 for electrical consulting on that project. Gray Line Solutions doesn't exist. No office, no employees, no tax returns, just a P.O. box and a bank account that traces back to a trust registered to Dalton Rusk's ex-wife. The wind outside shifted. The garage walls groaned. Curtis stared at the USB drive, then at the diagram, then at the boy. "You're 14, he said. "Yes, sir." "You broke into a government building." "Yes, sir." "And you walked 11 miles through a blizzard to bring this to a motorcycle club." Elias's jaw tightened. Something flickered behind those pale eyes. Not defiance, but something closer to desperation dressed up in composure. "I tried other people first," he said quietly. "I went to my dad's old lawyer. He told me the case was closed and to stop calling. I went to the newspaper. They said they couldn't print accusations against a city official without corroboration. I went to the police." He paused. "They called the group home. The group home called Dalton Rusk's office because Rusk sits on the county child welfare board." Curtis closed his eyes. 24 hours later, someone broke into my room at the group home. They took my laptop, my notebooks, everything I had. They left the window open so it looked like I ran away." Elias's voice didn't waver. "I did run away because I figured out they weren't trying to steal my evidence. They were trying to find out how much I knew and who I'd talked to." The garage was dead silent except for the hum of the generator and the moan of the wind. "So I came here," Elias said, "because my dad said you were the only people in this town who wouldn't sell him out." He looked at Curtis with those old, colorless eyes. Was he wrong? Curtis felt every year of his life settle into his bones like cold water filling a crack in concrete. He looked at the men in the room, Roach at the gate, Dex by the kitchen, Stitch with his medic's eyes and his quiet calculations, Harlow in the doorway with his arms still crossed and his jaw working like he was chewing on something he couldn't swallow. These men. His men. Broken in ways the world would never understand and strong in ways the world would never acknowledge. Veterans who still woke up screaming at 3 a.m. Addicts who counted their sober days like prayers. Fathers who hadn't seen their kids in years. Husbands who had failed every woman who ever loved them. Men who wore leather and rode loud machines and let the world call them outlaws, because the alternative, letting the world see what was underneath the leather, was worse. They weren't heroes. They had never been heroes. But they were the only people in this kid's world who hadn't turned him away. Curtis opened his eyes. "No," he said. He wasn't wrong. He picked up the USB drive. It was warm from the boy's pocket, small, light. The kind of thing you could lose in a couch cushion. The kind of thing that could destroy a man's career or free an innocent one, depending on who held it. "Dex," Curtis said. "Set up the back room. Kid needs sleep." "I don't sleep," Elias said. Curtis looked at him. "I mean, I can't. Not lately." Stitch stood up. "I've got something for that. Mild. Over the counter. Won't knock you out, just takes the edge off." Elias hesitated. Something moved across his face. The ghost of vulnerability, There and gone so fast you'd miss it if you blinked. Okay, he said softly. They set him up in the back room on an old army cot with 2 wool blankets and a space heater pointed at his feet. Stitch cleaned the mild frostbite on his left toes. Nothing that would scar, but enough to hurt like fire as the feeling came back. The boy didn't make a sound. He just watched with those pale eyes while the medic worked, his hand still in his lap, still wrapped around the folded diagram like it was the last piece of his father he had left. Curtis stood in the doorway and watched until the boy's eyes finally closed. It took 47 minutes. He counted. Then he walked back to the main garage, sat down at the workbench, and plugged the USB drive into the old desktop computer that Roach used for parts inventory. The files opened slowly. Scanned documents, some of them crooked, some blurry. The work of a kid in a hurry with limited time and a basement window that didn't lock. But the content was there. Inspection reports with signatures that didn't match the inspector on record. Contract amendments dated after the warehouse fire. Payment receipts to Gray Line Solutions. And at the bottom, buried in a subfolder labeled CW Dashboard, a set of emails between Dalton Rusk and a name Curtis didn't recognize. Someone at the state level, someone with authority over infrastructure funding. The emails were careful, coded, bureaucratic language that said nothing and meant everything. But one line stood out, time-stamped 3 days before the warehouse fire. The Calhoun issue will resolve itself. No further action required from your end. Curtis stared at that line until the words blurred. Then he lit another cigarette and called a number he hadn't dialed in 20 years. The phone rang 4 times. A woman's voice answered, rough with sleep and irritation. "It's 2 in the morning, Curtis." "Mama Jean," he said. "I need to talk to you about Tom Mercer." Silence on the line. Long, heavy. The kind of silence that has teeth. "Tom Mercer is in prison, Curtis." "I know, and I think I know why he shouldn't be." More silence. Then a long exhale. The sound of a woman in her 70s who had seen too much to be surprised by anything but was still exhausted by all of it. "I'll be at the shop at 8, she said. "Have coffee ready, the real kind. Not that gas station poison Roach drinks." She hung up. Curtis set the phone down and looked across the dark garage. The overhead lights had gone to half power on the storm timer, casting everything in a dull amber wash that made the oil stains on the concrete look like old blood stains. The Harleys lined up along the far wall gleamed faintly, chrome and black steel, patient and silent, waiting for the road the way they always waited. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked. It wasn't Lena. It was a text from an unknown number. No name, no caller ID, just 6 words on a white screen. "Return the boy, or it gets worse." Curtis stared at the message. Then he looked toward the back room where Elias Mercer was finally sleeping for the first time in days. And outside, through the snow and the dark and the screaming wind, the sound of a car engine idling at the end of the road. Headlights off, just sitting there, waiting. The car at the end of the road didn't move for 3 hours. Curtis watched it from the front window of the garage, standing just far enough back that his silhouette wouldn't show against the glass. He'd killed the overhead lights in the front bay and was working by the pale glow of a desk lamp turned toward the wall. The cigarette in his hand had gone out twice. He kept forgetting to relight it. Roach stood behind him, arms folded, breathing through his nose like a bull deciding whether or not to charge. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. 20 years of riding together had built a language between them that operated below words. A shifting of weight, a turn of the jaw, a way of exhaling that meant I see it too. At 4:52 a.m., the car pulled away. Slow. No headlights, just the faint red pulse of brake lights bleeding through the snow as it turned east on Route 9 and disappeared. Roach grunted. "Plates?" Curtis asked. "Couldn't see. Too much snow." Roach's voice was low. The kind of quiet that big men use when the situation calls for precision instead of force. County vehicle, though. Shape was right. One of those new Dodge Fleet trucks the city ordered last spring. Curtis said nothing. He turned the dead cigarette between his fingers, once, twice, then dropped it in the ashtray on the windowsill. "Wake everyone up," he said. "Full table, 6 a.m. It's not even 5. Then they've got an hour to make coffee." The table was a slab of reclaimed oak that had been in the garage since before Curtis took over the club. It sat in the center of the main bay, scarred with cigarette burns, ring stains, scratches from belt buckles and knife tips, and one deep gouge near the east end where a man named Bobby Lyle had slammed a hatchet into the wood during a vote in 1997. Bobby was dead now, heart attack at 51, but the gouge remained. Nobody had ever filled it. It was a reminder that democracy and the Steel Reapers sometimes drew blood. By 6, every member in Harlan County was at the table or on the phone. 8 men in total. Curtis at the head, Roach to his right, Dex to his left, Stitch across from him, Harlow at the far end leaning back with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. 3 others filled the remaining seats. Mooney, a wiry ex-con who ran the club's tow service and hadn't smiled since his son's funeral 4 years ago. Pike, a broad-shouldered Lakota man who barely spoke and communicated primarily through a series of devastating silences. And Briggs, the youngest full member at 31, a former Army mechanic who had come home from his second deployment with a Purple Heart, a titanium rod in his femur, and a drinking problem that he was managing poorly. Curtis laid the USB drive on the table, then the hand-drawn diagram, then his phone, screen up, showing the text message. Return the boy or it gets worse. He let them look. He didn't explain. He didn't narrate. He waited. Stitch picked up the diagram first, studied it, passed it to Mooney. Mooney held it at arm's length. His reading glasses were in his truck and he'd die before admitting he needed them, squinted, and passed it to Pike. Pike looked at it for 3 seconds, set it down, and said nothing. Harlow reached across the table and picked up Curtis's phone. He read the message. His jaw tightened. He set the phone down and looked at Curtis with eyes that had the flat, measuring quality of a man calculating odds. "Who sent it?" Harlow asked. "Unknown number." "Rusk?" "Don't know." "You think it's Rusk?" "I think it doesn't matter who sent it. What matters is somebody knows the kid is here and they want him back." Silence. The space heaters rattled. Outside, the storm had downgraded from fury to a steady grinding snowfall that turned the world into gray static. Briggs spoke first. He always did. It was the thing Curtis liked least about him, and the thing that would eventually either get him killed or make him president. "So what are we doing? Playing foster home? We're a motorcycle club, Curtis. We ride bikes, we fix engines, we throw a veterans rally once a year that barely breaks even. We're not set up for this." "Set up for what?" "For taking in some kid and going to war with a city official." Curtis looked at Briggs. The younger man held his gaze for about 4 seconds before looking down at his hands. That was 3 seconds longer than most people managed. "Nobody said anything about war," Curtis said. "That text message says it," Harlow cut in, pointing at the phone. "Return the boy or it gets worse." "That's not a suggestion. That's a threat from someone with enough power to follow through." "I know what it is." "Do you? Because I've been sitting here for 20 minutes and I haven't heard a plan. I've heard a kid's story and a USB drive that may or may not contain anything that'll hold up in court, and a threat on your phone from someone who knows where we live." Harlow leaned forward. "Curtis, I've ridden with you for 16 years. I've never questioned a call you've made. I'm questioning this one." The room shifted. Not physically, nobody moved, but the weight of the air changed. Every man at the table felt it, the tipping point between unity and fracture, the moment when a brotherhood stops being automatic and becomes a choice. Curtis didn't react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or back. He sat with his hands flat on the scarred oak table and let the silence do what silence does best, force people to fill it with the truth. "My concern isn't the kid," Harlow continued, measuring each word carefully. "My concern is what happens to this club if we step into something we can't step out of. Rusk has city contracts. He has connections at the state level. He sits on 3 county boards. He can pull our permits. He can shut down ironworks. He can audit every member of this club back to the day they were born, and you and I both know not everyone at this table has clean paper." Mooney's jaw tightened. He stared at the table. He didn't look up. "We have 12 employees in the shop," Harlow said. 8 of them are vets on work programs. They lose this job. They lose housing. They lose housing. They go back to the street. We're not just talking about us. We're talking about people who depend on us. That landed. Curtis could see it in the way Dex's eyes dropped, in the way Stitch's fingers went still on the diagram, in the way Roach, loyal, unshakable Roach, exhaled through his nose and looked at the ceiling. Harlow wasn't wrong. That was the problem. The man was never wrong about the math. He could calculate risk the way some people calculated wind speed, instinctively, precisely, without emotion. It was what made him valuable. It was also what made him dangerous, because there are moments in life when the math says run and something deeper says stay. Curtis looked at Harlow for a long time. Then he looked at each man at the table, one by one, the way he always did before a vote. Not to pressure, not to plead, just to see them, just to make sure they saw him seeing them. Tom Mercer sat in this garage, Curtis said quietly. He fixed Mooney's transmission for free because Mooney was behind on rent. He rewired Briggs's apartment when the landlord wouldn't. He drove 2 hours to Lincoln to testify as a character witness when Dex got picked up on that possession charge, and he'd never even met Dex before that week. Curtis paused. He did those things because somebody asked him to, and he was the kind of man who showed up. He picked up the diagram from the table. Now his son walked 11 miles barefoot through a blizzard to bring us this, because Tom told him we were the kind of men who show up. He set the diagram back down. I'm not ordering anyone to do anything. This goes to a vote. But I want every man in this room to look me in the eye and tell me what we are. Because if we're just a club, just bikes and beer and a patch on a vest, then Harlow's right. We send the kid to social services and we lock the gate and we wait for this to pass. But if we're something else... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The vote was 5-3. Harlow voted no. Briggs voted no. Mooney voted no, quietly, with his eyes on the table, and Curtis understood. Mooney had a record, a clean paper problem, and a fear that ran deeper than loyalty. Curtis didn't judge him for it. Fear is not cowardice. Fear is the body's way of remembering what it survived. But 5-3 was enough. The motion carried. Elias Mercer was under the protection of the Steel Reapers, and every man at that table knew that the words "under the protection of" were just the polite version of what was actually happening, which was that 8 flawed men in a freezing garage had just painted a target on their own backs for a kid they'd known for less than 6 hours. After the vote, the room emptied slowly. Men drifted to their corners, Roach to the front gate, Dex to the kitchen, Stitch to check on the boy. Briggs left without a word, which was unusual and concerning. Mooney lingered by the door, hands in his jacket pockets, mouth working like he wanted to say something. Curtis waited. I wasn't voting against the kid, Mooney said finally. I know. I have a parole review in March. I know that too. Mooney looked at him. Behind the wire-rimmed glasses and the sunken cheeks and the grief that had turned his face into a landscape of quiet devastation. Since his boy's funeral, there was something fragile, something that wanted permission. If this goes sideways and they start pulling records, if it goes sideways, I'll take the weight, all of it. Your name stays out. Mooney stared at him, then nodded once, sharply, like a man accepting a deal he doesn't fully trust but needs to believe in. He turned and walked out into the snow. Curtis stood alone at the table. The garage was cold. The overhead lights buzzed. The wind had shifted again, coming from the north now, driving the snow in horizontal sheets that piled against the windows like something trying to get inside. His phone buzzed. He looked. It was Lena. Not a call this time. A text. I know about the Mercer kid. I know about Rusk. We need to talk. Don't ignore me again. Curtis read the message 3 times. His daughter's voice was in every word. Sharp, impatient, wounded in ways she'd never admit, and furious in ways she couldn't hide. Lena Vale was 27 years old, a self-taught systems analyst who worked contract cybersecurity jobs from a studio apartment in Omaha and hadn't spoken to her father face-to-face since her mother's funeral 6 years ago. She had her mother's intelligence and her father's stubbornness, which meant she was brilliant and impossible, and the only person on earth who could make Curtis Vale feel like a failure just by existing. He hadn't been there when it mattered. That was the simple version. The complicated version involved a deployment, a relapse, A marriage that was already cracking before he shipped out and shattered completely by the time he came home to find his wife sick and his daughter raising herself in a house that smelled like hospital disinfectant and silence. He'd chosen the club over his family. No, that wasn't honest. He'd chosen the club because he didn't know how to be in the same room as his dying wife without falling apart, and the club was the only place where falling apart wasn't an option. The club needed him functional. His family needed him present. He could do one but not both, and he chose the one that didn't require him to feel. By the time Sarah died, Lena had already stopped calling him Dad. She called him Curtis. When she called at all, he stared at the text. "Don't ignore me again." He typed back, "How do you know about this?" The response came in 11 seconds. "Because I've been investigating Rusk for 8 months. Because I hacked the county record system in March and found the same shell company the kid found. Because I've been trying to call you for 2 weeks, and you won't pick up the phone, and now a 14-year-old boy is doing the job I needed your help with." Curtis's hands went still on the phone. 8 months. His daughter had been investigating Dalton Rusk for 8 months. She'd found Gray Line Solutions. She'd found the shell company. She'd been trying to reach him. 3 missed calls, the ones he'd ignored last night, not out of some sudden desire for reconciliation, but because she needed the Steel Reapers and was too proud or too wounded to say it directly. And he'd ignored every call, because he was afraid of his own daughter's voice. He sat down heavily in the chair at the head of the table. The oak creaked beneath him. He looked at the USB drive, still sitting where he'd left it. Then at his phone. Then at the hallway that led to the back room where Elias Mercer was sleeping on an army cot with borrowed boots beside the bed and a hand-drawn diagram under his pillow. 2 broken children, both carrying evidence against the same man, both trying to bring it to the Steel Reapers, both ignored or turned away by every institution that was supposed to protect them. And in the middle, Curtis Vale, a man who couldn't even protect his own daughter from the damage of his absence. He typed back, "Come to the garage. Bring everything you have." Then he set the phone down and went to find more coffee, because the day was about to get very long, and the weight in his chest was the kind that caffeine couldn't fix, but silence would make worse. Lena arrived at 11:40 a.m. She drove a gray Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and Nebraska plates that were 2 months expired. She parked by the front gate, got out without hesitation, and walked through the snow toward the garage door with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a face that could have been carved from the same stone as her father's. Same jaw, same dark eyes, same way of holding her mouth when she was angry, which, based on Curtis's experience, was most of the time. She was thin in a way that suggested she forgot to eat, not that she couldn't afford to. Her hair was dark, cut short, practical. She wore a black canvas jacket that wasn't warm enough for the weather and boots that had seen better years. No jewelry, no makeup, no softness anywhere in her posture. She stopped 6 feet from Curtis, who was standing in the open bay door with his hands in his vest pockets. They looked at each other. 6 years compressed into a silence that tasted like rust and regret. "You look old," she said. "You look cold." "I am cold. Come inside." She walked past him without closing the distance. Not a hug, not a handshake. Just proximity. The bare minimum acknowledgement that they occupied the same space and shared the same blood, and neither of them knew what to do about it. The garage was warmer now. Dex had gotten the second space heater running, and Stitch had made a pot of real coffee. The good stuff, dark roast, from a bag that Mama Jean had dropped off at 8 that morning, along with a box of files and a look on her face that said she had opinions but was saving them. Lena sat down at the workbench, opened her laptop, and started talking. No preamble, no catching up, no, "How have you been?" Just data. "Dalton Rusk has been running a kickback scheme through city infrastructure contracts for at least 7 years, she said, fingers moving across the keyboard as she pulled up files. Gray Line Solutions is the primary vehicle. Shell company, registered in Delaware, P.O. box in Omaha, bank account at a regional credit union in Grand Island. Total disbursements since 2019, $2.3 million. Stitch whistled low from the other side of the room. He uses city contracts as the funnel. Real projects, road work, electrical upgrades, building inspections, but with inflated budgets. The overages get routed through Gray Line as consulting fees. On paper, it looks like standard government contracting. In practice, it's embezzlement. She turned the laptop to face Curtis. The screen showed a web of connections. Names, dates, dollar amounts, linked by lines that Curtis didn't fully understand but could feel the weight of. The Calhoun Street warehouse fire wasn't an accident, and it wasn't arson, Lena continued. It was a controlled failure designed to destroy records. The warehouse was being used as a storage facility for infrastructure project files, paper records, pre-digital. Some of those records contained the original contracts that would have shown the discrepancies. Rusk needed them gone. And Tom Mercer? Curtis asked. Convenient. A union electrician who'd filed complaints about inspection shortcuts on 3 separate projects. He was already making noise. After the fire, Rusk testified that Mercer had been on site and had expressed frustration. The DA ran with it. Mercer's public defender was fresh out of law school, underfunded, and missed the filing deadline for 3 separate motions, including the one that would have entered Tom's own electrical diagrams into evidence. She paused. Something shifted in her face. A crack in the professional armor, hairline thin but visible. The public defender's name was Kevin Brandt. He left public defense 6 months after the trial. He now works for a private firm in Omaha that does contract law for municipal governments. She looked at Curtis. One of their clients is Harlan County. Curtis felt the pattern tightening like a noose. Every thread connected. Every coincidence wasn't. There's more, Lena said. And this is the part that made me start calling you. She pulled up another file. 3 weeks ago, the county board voted to fast-track a new infrastructure project, a $4.8 million electrical grid upgrade for the Harlan Industrial Corridor. The project manager listed on the bid documents is Grayline Solutions. The county official who signed off on the contract is Dalton Rusk, and the project timeline requires demolition of 4 existing structures in the corridor, one of which... She turned the screen toward Curtis again. The building on the screen was the Steel Reaper's garage. Curtis stared at it. Eminent domain filing was submitted last Tuesday, Lena said quietly. You haven't been served yet, but the paperwork is in the system. They're taking the building, Curtis. They're taking everything. The room went still. Curtis looked at the screen, at the building that had been his home, his sanctuary, his reason for getting up in the morning for 20 years, at the walls that held the ghosts of every man who had ever worn the patch, and the memory of every night he had spent alone at the workbench, because going home to an empty house was worse than staying. They were taking it. Rusk was taking it. And he'd been sending threatening texts about a boy because the boy had found the same thread that could unravel everything. Harlow appeared in the doorway. He'd been listening. Curtis didn't know for how long. Still think this isn't a war? Harlow asked. Curtis didn't answer. He looked at Lena, at the laptop, at the web of connections on the screen, then down the hallway toward the back room. Elias was standing there, barefoot again, the borrowed boots left beside the cot. He was holding his diagram against his chest with both hands, and his eyes, those pale, ancient, unblinking eyes, were moving between Curtis and Lena and the laptop screen with the quick, pattern-seeking precision of a mind that couldn't read words properly, but could disassemble a system just by looking at it. The grid upgrade, Elias said quietly. It's the same design flaw, scaled up. Lena turned to look at him. Something crossed her face. Recognition, maybe. The look of one pattern reader seeing another. What do you mean? She asked. The Calhoun method. Cut neutral. Delayed overload. If you build that flaw into the new grid at the junction level, you can trigger a cascade failure anytime you want. Shut down power to the whole corridor. Blame the weather. Blame the equipment. Nobody checks twice. Lena stared at him, then back at her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys. He's right, she said after 30 seconds. The grid design in the bid documents, it's not just overpriced. It's structurally compromised. If this gets built as specified, Rusk would have a kill switch for the entire industrial district's power supply. The implication sank through the room like cold water through cracked concrete. This wasn't just embezzlement. This wasn't just framing an innocent man. This was infrastructure as a weapon. Control the grid. Control the corridor. Control the corridor. Control the contracts, the businesses, the jobs, the permits, the entire economic lifeline of a town that was already dying. Dalton Rusk wasn't just stealing money. He was building a machine that would make him untouchable. And the only people who saw it were a 14-year-old boy who couldn't read, a 27-year-old hacker who hadn't spoken to her father in 6 years, and a room full of broken bikers in a garage that was already slated for demolition. Curtis stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the concrete. The sound cut through the silence like a blade. He looked at Harlow. He looked at Roach. He looked at Lena, who was watching him with the same expression she'd had at her mother's funeral, angry and waiting and desperate for him to do something that proved he was still worth believing in. He looked at Elias, who wasn't waiting for anything at all, who had stopped waiting a long time ago and was just standing there, barefoot, holding a dead man's diagram against his chest, ready to keep going whether anyone came with him or not. Curtis picked up his phone from the table. He opened the text from the unknown number. "Return the boy, or it gets worse." He typed 2 words and hit send. "Come try." Then he turned the phone off, set it face down on the table, and looked at the room. "We're going to need every piece of evidence we have on hard copy, printed, backed up, stored in 3 different locations." He looked at Lena. "Can you do that?" "Already started. We're going to need the original case files from the Mercer trial, court records, testimony transcripts." "Mama Jean has courthouse contacts," Stitch said, "and we're going to need to do the one thing that nobody in this room is going to like." Curtis paused. He felt the weight of what he was about to say before the words left his mouth. "We're going to need to go public." The silence after that was absolute. Going public meant exposure. Going public meant cameras and reporters, and questions about criminal records and probation violations, and custody disputes, and every shameful, private, painful thing that every man in this room had spent years burying under leather and engine noise. Going public meant the world would see them, not as they saw themselves, but as the world always saw men like them, dangerous, disposable, criminal. Going public meant Rusk would know exactly what they had, and exactly where they were. And going public meant there was no going back. Harlow pushed off the door frame and walked to the table. He stood across from Curtis. The 2 men looked at each other for a long, measured moment. "If we do this," Harlow said, "we do it right. No half measures, no cowboy moves. We build the case. We find a journalist with teeth, and we do not give Rusk a single excuse to paint us as the bad guys." Curtis nodded. "I voted no this morning," Harlow said. "I'm changing my vote." He extended his hand across the scarred oak table. Curtis took it. And somewhere in the hallway, Elias Mercer watched 2 men shake hands over a decision that would either free his father or destroy every person in the room, and he held his diagram a little tighter against his chest, because it was the only thing he had left of a man who once told him that the truth was worth more than safety. And tonight, for the first time in 3 years, someone was finally acting like they believed it. Outside, the snow kept falling. The Harleys sat silent in the cold. And in a city office 14 miles away, a phone lit up with a 2-word message that Dalton Rusk read 3 times before setting it down on his desk with hands that were not quite steady. "Come try." He picked up his desk phone and dialed a number. "We have a problem," he said. "The Reapers aren't backing down. Activate the permits, all of them. And call the county sheriff. I want that garage inspected by morning." He hung up. Then he opened his bottom drawer, pulled out a file labeled Mercer, T, Contingency, and began to read. The county sheriff arrived at 7:14 a.m. Not with sirens, not with lights. Just 2 unmarked SUVs pulling through the front gate that Roach had unlocked 10 minutes earlier for a parts delivery that never showed up. The first vehicle parked sideways across the entrance. The second rolled slow and deliberate into the yard, tires crunching fresh snow, and stopped 6 feet from the main bay door where Curtis was standing with a mug of black coffee in one hand and nothing in the other. 3 men stepped out. 2 deputies in tan winter jackets with the Harlan County patch on the shoulder. And Sheriff Gene Caldwell, a tall, thin man with a gray mustache and the permanent squint of someone who spent his entire career looking at things he'd rather not see and deciding how much of the truth he could afford. Curtis knew Gene. Everyone in Harlan knew Gene. He'd been sheriff for 14 years, which in a small county meant he'd arrested half the population and gone fishing with the other half. He wasn't corrupt exactly. He He was something worse. He was practical. He did what kept the machine running, and if the machine occasionally ground up an innocent man, well, that was the cost of keeping the gears turning. Gene stopped 5 feet from Curtis. His breath came out in white plumes that hung in the frozen air like punctuation marks. "Morning, Curtis." "Gene, got a complaint filed. Code enforcement. Says this building's operating as a residential facility without proper zoning permits." He pulled a folded paper from inside his jacket. "Also got a fire safety inspection order. Also got a report from Child Protective Services that a minor in state custody may be on these premises without authorization." Curtis sipped his coffee. It was lukewarm and bitter and perfect. "That's a lot of paper for 7 in the morning," he said. "It is." "Who filed the complaints?" Gene's mustache twitched. It was the closest thing to discomfort his face ever showed. "County Infrastructure Office." "Rusk, I didn't say that. You didn't need to." The 2 deputies had positioned themselves on either side of the bay door. Not aggressive, just present. The kind of positioning that says we're here to watch, and also we can escalate whenever we want. Curtis noted the body cameras on their chests, both recording, red lights steady. "I need to come inside, Curtis." "You got a warrant?" "Don't need one for a code enforcement inspection. You know that." Curtis did know that. He also knew that a code enforcement inspection could turn into a criminal search the moment an officer claimed to see something in plain view that suggested illegal activity. A weapon left on a counter, a controlled substance in a medicine cabinet, a minor without documentation. Anything. He looked at Gene. Gene looked back. Gene, 2 men who had known each other for decades, standing 5 feet apart in the snow, having a conversation that was really about something neither of them would say out loud. "There's a boy inside," Curtis said. "He's 14. He walked here through the storm 2 nights ago. He was barefoot. He had frostbite. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The group home he came from didn't report him missing for 36 hours. Gene's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. "That boy is in state custody, Curtis. You're not his guardian. You're not his family. Legally, you're harboring a runaway minor. Legally, the state lost track of a child in a blizzard and didn't notice for a day and a half. That's not your problem to solve." "Somebody has to." Gene exhaled. The plume of breath hung between them, then dissolved. "I'm coming inside," he said. "You can make this easy, or you can make this the thing that ends your club. Your choice." Curtis stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds. He could feel the weight of every man behind him. Roach somewhere near the tool racks, Dex in the kitchen, Stitch in the back room with Elias. He could feel the weight of the USB drive in the pocket of his vest, the hard copy files Lena had been printing since before dawn, the hand-drawn diagram that a boy carried like a talisman. He could feel the weight of the text message he'd sent last night. "Come try." They were trying. He stepped aside. Gene walked in with both deputies. They moved through the garage with practiced efficiency, checking fire extinguisher dates, outlet covers, posted capacity signs, emergency exit routes. One deputy took photographs. The other took notes on a clipboard. Gene walked slowly, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the room with those squinting practical eyes. Curtis followed at a distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't explain. He let them work, because interference gave them cause, and cause gave them escalation, and escalation gave Rusk exactly what he wanted. They reached the hallway to the back room. Gene stopped. "Is the boy back there?" "Yes." "I need to see him. He's sleeping." "Curtis?" "He's 14 years old, and he's been through more in the last week than your deputies have been through in their careers. Let him sleep." Gene turned to face him fully. Something moved behind the sheriff's eyes. Not compassion exactly, but a cousin of it. The recognition that comes from spending decades watching systems chew up people and spit out paperwork. "I have to call CPS," Gene said quietly. "You know I do." "I know." "They'll send someone to collect him, probably today. Probably back to the same group home. The same group home that let someone break into his room and steal his belongings. The same group home whose oversight board includes the man who framed his father." Gene's mustache twitched again. He looked down the hallway, then back at Curtis. "You're making accusations, Curtis." I'm stating facts. Facts need evidence. I have evidence. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. The two deputies stopped moving. One of them lowered his clipboard. Gene stood very still, his squinting eyes fixed on Curtis with a new quality. Not hostility, not sympathy, but the sharp alertness of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him is not as solid as he thought. What kind of evidence? Curtis didn't answer immediately. He was calculating. Every instinct built over 20 years of riding, leading, surviving, all of it running through the same equation. Trust the sheriff. Don't trust the sheriff. Show the cards. Hold the cards. Gene Caldwell wasn't Rusk's man. Curtis was fairly sure of that. But Gene Caldwell was the system's man, and the system was Rusk's machine, and the distinction between the two was getting thinner by the hour. The kind that needs to go to someone above county level, Curtis said carefully. Gene stared at him for a long time. Then he nodded once, a small, almost invisible movement that could have meant anything or nothing. I'm going to file my report, Gene said. The building has 3 code violations. Expired fire extinguisher in the East Bay. Missing exit sign above the back door. Insufficient insulation around the generator housing. You have 30 days to remediate. He paused. CPS will be here this afternoon. I suggest you have your legal situation figured out by then. He turned and walked back toward the front bay. The deputies followed. At the door, Gene stopped and looked back over his shoulder. Curtis? Yeah. Whatever evidence you think you have, if it's real, get it to someone who can do something with it, fast. Because the window you're standing in is closing, and the people on the other side of it don't play by rules you and I would recognize. Then he was gone. The SUVs pulled out. The gate swung closed, and the garage exhaled. Roach materialized beside Curtis like a mountain deciding to move. He gave us 30 days on the code violations, Roach said. He gave us until this afternoon on the kid. So what do we do? Curtis looked at his phone. It was 7:48 a.m. CPS would arrive by 2, maybe 3. 6 hours, maybe 7. To build a case, find a platform, go public, and somehow keep a 14-year-old boy from being swallowed back into the same system that had already failed him. He called Lena. She answered on the first ring. I heard the scanner traffic. They came? Code enforcement. CPS is next. We have hours, not days. I know, I've been working. Curtis, I found something else. The way she said it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not the words, the tone. The careful, controlled flatness of someone who has discovered something terrible and is trying to hold it at arm's length. What? Come to the workbench, bring Stitch, and bring the kid. She hung up. Curtis found Stitch in the back room. The medic was sitting in a folding chair beside the army cot, reading a paperback western with his glasses pushed up on his forehead. Elias was awake, sitting upright on the cot with his knees drawn to his chest, the diagram in his lap, those pale eyes tracking the room with the restless vigilance of an animal that had learned to sleep with one eye open. CPS is coming this afternoon, Curtis told Stitch. Stitch closed the book. He didn't ask questions. He just stood up. Kid, Curtis said, Lena found something. She needs you to see it. Elias unfolded from the cot. He'd put the borrowed boots on this time. They were too big, and he walked with the careful, slightly awkward gait of someone navigating oversized footwear, but he walked without hesitation. He carried the diagram in his left hand, folded once, held tight against his hip. They gathered at the workbench. Lena was there, laptop open, 2 printed stacks of paper beside her, and a look on her face that Curtis hadn't seen since the day she told him she was moving to Omaha and not coming back. Sit down, she said, not to her father, to Elias. The boy sat on the metal stool beside the bench. Lena turned the laptop toward him. I've been going through the county board meeting minutes from the last 3 years, she said. Specifically the Child Welfare Board. Rusk sits on it. He was appointed in 2021. Since his appointment, there have been 19 complaints filed about conditions at 3 group homes in Harlan County. 17 of those complaints were dismissed at the board level. The other 2 resulted in investigations that were closed without action. She pulled up a document, a table of names and dates. The group home on Pratt Street where you were placed, It's operated by a company called Cornerstone Youth Services. Cornerstone is a private contractor. They receive $127 per day per child from the state. They currently house 14 minors. Their last inspection was 11 months ago. The inspector who signed off was, let me guess, Curtis said, the same inspector who signed the Calhoun Street warehouse reports. A man named Dale Venner. He works for the county under Rusk's department. Stitch leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his face doing something complicated that involved both fury and exhaustion. So Rusk controls the infrastructure contracts, Stitch said slowly. He controls the inspections. He controls the child welfare board that oversees the group homes. And the group home that lost track of Elias is operated by a private company that answers to Rusk's department. Yes. Which means when Elias went to the group home staff for help and they called Rusk's office, they were calling the man who framed his father directly. The room went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Elias hadn't moved. He was staring at the laptop screen with those pale gray eyes, and Curtis could see the boy's mind working. The same pattern-seeking intelligence that could decode wiring diagrams was now mapping the architecture of the system that had swallowed his family. Load paths, junction points, points of failure. The boy was seeing it the way he saw circuits, not as isolated components, but as a connected system designed to do exactly what it was doing. There's more, Lena said. Her voice had gone very quiet. The controlled flatness was still there, but underneath it, something was breaking. Curtis could hear it the way you hear ice cracking on a river. Not the sound itself, but the absence of sound just before. 6 months ago, a 13-year-old girl at the Pratt Street home filed a complaint with her caseworker. She said the facility director had confiscated personal property from several children, phones, notebooks, documents, and turned them over to someone outside the home. The caseworker filed the report with the county board. The complaint was dismissed. She paused. The girl was moved to a different facility 2 weeks later. The facility is in Grand Island. It's also operated by Cornerstone Youth Services. Curtis felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger. He'd passed anger somewhere around 3 in the morning. This was something colder. Something that settled into the bones and didn't leave. The realization that the thing they were fighting wasn't a corrupt official or a shell company or even a criminal conspiracy. It was a machine. A system of interlocking parts designed to protect itself by consuming the people caught inside it. The children. The workers. The honest inspectors. The fathers who filed complaints. All of them. Raw material. Fuel for a machine that existed for no purpose except to perpetuate its own power. Elias spoke for the first time since sitting down. Her name was Maya, he said softly. She was my friend. Nobody moved. She showed me the notebooks they took. She kept records, times, dates, who came to the home, what they took. He paused. She was smarter than me about the people stuff. I could see the systems, but she could see the patterns in how people acted, who was scared, who was lying. Where is she now? Lena asked. Grand Island. She stopped answering the phone 3 months ago. The number got disconnected. Lena's hands went still on the keyboard. She looked at Curtis. Curtis looked at Stitch. Stitch looked at the floor, and the expression on his face was the one Curtis had only seen twice before. Once when Stitch talked about the field hospital outside Kandahar, and once when they buried Bobby Lyle. We need to find her, Elias said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking again. Not the fine tremor from the first night. This was deeper. This was the shaking of a body that was holding something so heavy that the muscles were beginning to fail. We will, Curtis said. We need to find her now. I know. You don't understand. Elias looked up at Curtis, and for the first time, the composure broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, just a fracture. A visible crack in the armor of a 14-year-old who had been carrying 3 years of grief and fear and silence on shoulders that were never built for it. She's the only other person who has evidence. If Rusk knows about me, he knows about her. And she doesn't have anyone. She doesn't have this. He gestured around the garage, at the workbench, at the tools, at the bikers, at the building itself. at the flawed, imperfect, fragile thing that these men had built out of wreckage and stubbornness and the refusal to let each other disappear. "She doesn't have anywhere to go," Elias said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Curtis pulled out his phone. He dialed Mama Jean. The old woman answered on the second ring with a voice like sandpaper and iron. "I need a contact at the Grand Island Family Court," Curtis said. "Someone who isn't connected to Cornerstone or the county board. Someone clean." "That's a short list." "How short?" "One name, maybe. Give me an hour." She hung up. Curtis looked at the room. Roach in the doorway, silent, massive, waiting. Dex by the kitchen with a dish rag over his shoulder and haunted eyes. Stitch against the wall, his medic's brain already calculating interventions. Lena at the laptop, her face locked in the expression that meant she was building something. A case, a weapon, a bridge to somewhere nobody else could see yet. And Elias, 14 years old, barefoot in borrowed boots, holding a dead man's diagram and a missing girl's memory, and the weight of a system that was designed to make people like him invisible. Curtis opened his mouth to speak. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. "Mr. Vale." The voice was calm, measured, professional. Not Rusk, someone else. Someone used to speaking in boardrooms and depositions and the careful, sterile language of power. "My name is Alan Cross. I'm an attorney representing Harlan County's interests in several pending matters. I'm calling to inform you that your property at 1847 Industrial Road has been placed on the county's eminent domain acquisition list. A formal notice will be served within 48 hours. "I'm aware." "Good. Then you're also aware that any attempt to interfere with county business, including the harboring of a minor in state custody, will be treated as a criminal matter. The county has filed for an emergency custody transfer. CPS will arrive at your location no later than 2 p.m. today." Curtis said nothing. He let the silence work. "Mr. Vale, I want to be very clear. The county is prepared to pursue this through every legal channel available. Building code violations, zoning infractions, tax audits, license reviews for every employee of Vale Ironworks, and criminal harboring charges against you personally, which carry up to 18 months in the state correctional facility." "Is that all?" "No." A pause. Deliberate. Theatrical. "The county is also prepared to offer a resolution. If the minor is returned to state custody voluntarily and all materials obtained from county records are surrendered, the code violations will be reduced, the eminent domain timeline will be extended, and no criminal charges will be filed against you or any member of your organization." Curtis looked at Elias. The boy was watching him with those pale eyes. Not pleading, not afraid, just watching. The way you watch the last door in a hallway close, one by one, until there's nowhere left to go. "You're offering me a deal," Curtis said. "I'm offering you a way out. A way out that puts a 14-year-old boy back in the hands of the people who lost him in the first place. A way out that keeps you out of prison and you're building off the demolition list. I suggest you take it seriously." Curtis pulled the phone away from his ear. He looked at it. Then he looked at the room, at the men, at his daughter, at the boy. "Mr. Cross," he said, let me ask you something." "Go ahead." "Does Dalton Rusk know you're making this call?" Silence. 3 seconds. 4. "I represent the county, Mr. Vale, not any individual." "That's not what I asked." More silence, then, "You have until 2 p.m. I strongly recommend you use that time wisely." The line went dead. Curtis set the phone on the workbench. The screen went dark. He stood there for a moment with his hands flat on the scarred oak surface and his head bowed, and every year of his life pulling at him like gravity had gotten personal. Then Lena said, "Curtis?" He looked up. Her face had changed. The controlled flatness was gone. In its place was something raw. Something he recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror every morning for 6 years. The look of someone who has just realized that the thing they've been running from is the same thing they've been running toward. "I found something else," she said, "in the Cornerstone financial records." "What?" She turned the laptop toward him. Cornerstone Youth Services was incorporated in 2018. The registered agent is a company called Mid-Plains Holdings. Mid-Plains Holdings is a subsidiary of a real estate investment trust based in Omaha. She paused. The trust's managing director is listed as Sarah Vale. The name hit Curtis like a bullet. Sarah Vale, his dead wife's name. The room stopped breathing. That's not possible, Curtis said. His voice came out wrong, thick, broken, like the words were being dragged through gravel. Sarah died in 2020. She was sick for 2 years before that. She didn't have business dealings. She was a school teacher. I know, Lena said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Someone used her name, her social security number, her identity. They incorporated this trust 6 months before she died, when she was already in hospice and couldn't have signed anything. Curtis gripped the edge of the workbench. His knuckles went white. The metal edge bit into his palms, and he didn't feel it. Who? The word came out like a wound. The trust documents were filed by the same firm that represents the county. Alan Cross's firm. Lena swallowed. And the co-signer on the incorporation papers, the person who witnessed the documents and verified Sarah's identity? She stopped. Her eyes were wet. She blinked once, hard, and the tears didn't fall, but they were there, bright and furious. Was Dalton Rusk? Curtis didn't move. He stood at the workbench with his hands gripping the edge and his body completely still. And inside him, something that had been holding together for 6 years. Through the funeral, through the silence, through the empty house, and the missed calls and the slow erosion of everything that had once made him human. Cracked. Not broke. Not shattered. Cracked. The way a dam cracks before it fails. A single line running through the concrete, invisible from the surface, catastrophic in the structure. They had used his wife. While she was dying. While she was lying in a hospital bed with tubes in her arms and the smell of antiseptic in her hair and the sound of machines counting down the minutes of her life. While Curtis was writing because he couldn't sit in that room and watch her go. While Lena was 19 years old and holding her mother's hand alone because her father was too broken to be present. During all of that, during the worst, most devastating chapter of their lives, someone had walked into a filing office and used Sarah Vale's name to build a shell company that would funnel money through children's homes and infrastructure contracts and the systematic destruction of families like the Mercers. They had used her name to build the machine. Curtis's vision narrowed. The edges went gray. He was aware of Roach moving toward him, of Stitch saying something he couldn't hear, of Lena's hands on the keyboard going still. He was aware of Elias watching him from the stool with those ancient gray eyes. The boy who had lost his father to this machine, watching the man who had just learned his dead wife was welded into its frame. Curtis? Roach's hand on his shoulder, heavy, steady. An anchor. Breathe. He breathed in, out. The garage air, diesel, coffee, cold metal, old smoke. In, out. The crack held. The dam didn't break. Not yet. Curtis straightened. He released the workbench. There were white marks in his palms where the metal edge had bitten in. He looked at Lena. Can you prove this? The documents are in the public record. Incorporation filings, trust registrations, social security number matches. Her voice was shaking now, the professional armor finally failing. It's all there. They didn't even bother to hide it well because they never thought anyone would look. Why would they? Who looks into the finances of a dead school teacher in a town nobody cares about? Nobody answered, because the answer was nobody. Nobody looks. Nobody checks. Nobody cares, until a barefoot boy walks through a blizzard and a daughter hacks a database and a broken father picks up the phone. Curtis turned to face the room. Every man was watching him. Every face carried the same expression. The mixture of rage and grief and helpless determination that comes from realizing the enemy is bigger than you thought and the fight is more personal than you imagined, and there is no version of walking away that doesn't mean becoming someone you can't live with. 2 p.m., Curtis said. His voice was steady now, cold. The voice of a man who has passed through the worst moment and come out the other side not healed, not whole, but functional, operational. Dangerous in the way that only broken things are dangerous, unpredictable, unafraid of further damage, with nothing left to protect except the people standing beside him. CPS comes at 2. That gives us 6 hours. He looked at Lena. Build the case file? Everything. Gray line, cornerstone, the trust, Sarah's name, all of it. Print 3 copies. He looked at Stitch. Call Mama Jean. Get that Grand Island contact. Find Maya. He looked at Roach. Lock the gate. Nobody in or out without my say. He looked at Elias. The boy looked back. Kid, Curtis said, I need you to do something hard. Okay? I need you to go on camera. I need you to tell the world what you told me. The diagrams, the sabotage, your father, everything. Elias's hands tightened on the diagram. His jaw clenched. The tremor came back. That deep structural shaking that started in the shoulders and ran down through the fingers. I can't read, he said quietly. I can't. The words get mixed up. I'll sound stupid. You won't. People will see me. They'll see. He gestured at himself. The oversized shirt, the borrowed boots, the greasy hands, the hollow cheeks. Everything about him that the world used to decide he wasn't worth listening to. They'll see a kid who walked through a blizzard to tell the truth, Curtis said. That's enough. Elias looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Lena, then at Stitch, then at Roach, then back at Curtis. My dad said the truth was worth more than safety. Your dad was right. Elias nodded. Once. Small. The nod of a boy agreeing to step off a cliff because the only alternative is standing still while the ground crumbles beneath him. Okay, he said. Curtis turned to Harlow, who had been standing at the edge of the room, silent, watching, calculating. Harlow, you know people at the Lincoln Journal-Star, someone with teeth, someone who won't fold. Harlow looked at him, and for the first time since this began, the calculating expression softened into something that might have been respect. I know one person, Harlow said. She's not at the paper anymore. She's independent, does investigative work. She's been looking for something on Rusk for 2 years but couldn't get anyone to talk. Will she come? If I tell her what we have, she'll drive through the storm. Call her. Harlow pulled out his phone and walked toward the front bay. His boots echoed on the concrete, steady, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had changed his mind about something and was now moving with the full weight of conviction. Curtis looked at the clock on the wall. 8:22 a.m. 5 hours and 38 minutes until CPS arrived. 5 hours and 38 minutes to build a case, find a missing girl, set up a live stream, and turn a biker garage into the last line of defense for a 14-year-old boy who couldn't read but could see the architecture of corruption more clearly than anyone in the county. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was the color of wet steel. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the wind, the low growl of engines. Not Harley's, but something else. Something heavier. County vehicles moving on the highway. Heading north. Coming closer. Curtis lit a cigarette. The ember caught on the first strike. He inhaled, held it, exhaled slow. The smoke curled into the cold air of the garage and dissolved. All right, he said to nobody and everybody. Let's go to war. And the clock on the wall kept ticking. The journalist arrived at 9:17 a.m. Her name was Rachel Dunn. She drove a dented Subaru Outback with press credentials expired 2 years ago, still clipped to the sun visor and a back seat full of file boxes, recording equipment, and the accumulated debris of someone who had been chasing one story for so long it had become her entire life. She was 43, sharp-featured, with cropped red hair going gray at the temples and the wired, sleepless energy of a person running on conviction instead of rest. She'd lost her position at the Lincoln Journal-Star 18 months ago after her editor killed a piece on municipal corruption in rural Nebraska. The official reason was budget cuts. The real reason was a phone call from someone at the state capitol to someone on the paper's board, and after that, Rachel Dunn became a freelancer with a Substack, a podcast with 400 subscribers, and the kind of reputation that made officials in small counties very nervous. Harlow met her at the gate and walked her in. She didn't shake hands. She didn't make small talk. She walked to the workbench, set down a recorder, looked at the laptop screen and said, "Start from the beginning." Lena started from the beginning. It took 47 minutes. Rachel didn't interrupt. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes moving between Lena's face and the screen with the controlled intensity of someone assembling a machine in her head, connecting pieces, testing joints, looking for the weak points that would break under pressure. When Lena finished, Rachel sat back. She was quiet for 12 seconds. Curtis counted. The Saravale identity theft, Rachel said. That's your keystone. Everything else, the shell companies, the contracts, the inspections, that's corruption. That's embezzlement. People hear that and they think numbers on a spreadsheet. But a dying woman's identity stolen to build a company that profits off children in state care? She looked at Curtis. That's a story people will feel in their chest. That's a story that doesn't die. Curtis said nothing. The cigarette in his hand had gone out again. He didn't relight it. I need the boy on camera, Rachel said. I need him explaining the electrical sabotage in his own words. His diagrams, his voice. Not polished, not coached, just him. He's 14, Stitch said from the wall. I know how old he is. He's been through hell. I know that too. Rachel turned to face Stitch fully. Her eyes were hard but not unkind. The eyes of someone who had learned that gentleness and urgency could coexist if you held them right. I've spent 2 years trying to crack Dalton Rusk. I've had 3 sources ghost me. 1 moved out of state. 1 recanted after her landlord got a visit from a county inspector. I have boxes of documents that prove half of what your girl just showed me, and none of it matters without a face. Without a human being who looks into a camera and says, "This happened to me." That's how you beat a machine. Not with paper, with a person. The room was silent. He agreed, Curtis said. This morning, he agreed to do it. Then let's do it before someone takes that choice away from him. They set up in the main bay, not the back room. Too dark, too small, too much like hiding. Lena argued for the garage floor itself, with the Harleys in the background and the workbench visible and the oil stains on the concrete and the buzzing fluorescence overhead. No staging, no backdrop, no production value, just a boy in a garage surrounded by the only people who didn't throw him away. Rachel set up 2 cameras, her main unit on a tripod and her phone propped against a toolbox as backup. She wired a lapel mic to a portable recorder and tested levels, while Dex moved the space heaters closer so Elias wouldn't shiver on camera. Elias sat on a metal stool in the center of the bay. He was wearing the same faded Metallica shirt. Lena had offered him something cleaner, but he shook his head. The shirt was his. It was real. It was the thing he was wearing when he walked 11 miles through a blizzard, and he was going to wear it now. His diagrams were spread on his lap. His hands were shaking. Curtis knelt beside the stool. The concrete was cold through his jeans. He was eye level with the boy now, close enough to see the faint purple circles beneath those pale eyes, and the way his jaw was clenched so tight the tendons stood out in his neck like cables. You don't have to do this, Curtis said quietly. Yes, I do. Nobody here will think less of you if you... I said I'll do it. Curtis looked at him. The boy looked back, and Curtis saw it. The thing he'd been seeing since the first night but hadn't wanted to name. Elias Mercer wasn't brave. He was terrified. He was 14 years old and terrified in a way that most adults never experience because most adults have never had every single institution designed to protect them turn into the thing trying to destroy them. But terror and courage aren't opposites. Terror is the prerequisite. Courage is what happens when you move anyway. Okay, Curtis said. He stood up, his knees cracked. Okay. Rachel checked the cameras, checked the mic, checked the light. Whenever you're ready, she said. Elias looked down at his diagrams. He smoothed them with both hands, the trembling fingers pressing the creased paper flat against his thighs, tracing the lines his father had drawn in a prison cell with a stubby pencil, and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would eventually look at them and see the truth. Then he looked up. My name is Elias Mercer, he said. His voice cracked on the first word and steadied on the second. I'm 14. My dad is in prison for something he didn't do, and I can prove it. He held up the diagram. This is a wiring schematic for the Calhoun Street warehouse electrical system. My dad drew it. He was a licensed electrician. He knew that system because he helped build it, and he knew it didn't fail on its own. His voice was quiet but clear. He didn't look at the camera. He looked at the diagram because that was where he was comfortable, in the language of systems and circuits and things that followed logical rules, even when people didn't. A neutral line was cut at the main junction, right here, he pointed. When you cut the neutral, the load redistributes unevenly. Phase 1 takes more than it's rated for. The transformer starts to heat, slow. Hours. By the time it trips, the arc flash looks like equipment failure. Nobody checks twice. He lowered the diagram. Except my dad checked. He drew these diagrams and sent them to his lawyer. His lawyer never filed them. His lawyer now works for a firm that represents the county. The same county where the man who testified against my dad controls the infrastructure contracts and the building inspections, and the board that oversees the group home where I was placed after my dad went to prison. His voice didn't waver. His hands did, the tremor visible even on camera, but his voice held. That man's name is Dalton Rusk. He used to be a biker. Now he runs the county's infrastructure office. He created a fake company called Gray Line Solutions and used it to steal millions from city contracts. When my dad started asking questions about bad inspections, Rusk set up the warehouse fire to destroy the records and framed my dad for arson. Elias paused. He looked up from the diagram for the first time and stared directly into the camera lens. Those pale gray eyes, ancient, exhausted, absolutely certain. 2 nights ago, someone sabotaged the generator at this garage using the exact same method, cut neutral, delayed overload, clean failure. The same method used on Calhoun Street, because I came here with evidence and someone wants me to disappear the way my dad disappeared. He folded the diagram carefully and held it against his chest. I can't read very well. Words don't make sense in my head the way they're supposed to, but circuits make sense, systems make sense. And this system, the one that took my dad and put me in a home run by the man who framed him, this system is broken on purpose. It was built to be broken, and I'm asking anyone who's watching to help me prove it. Silence. Rachel let the camera run for 5 more seconds. Then she reached over and stopped the recording. Nobody in the garage moved. Dex was standing by the kitchen doorway with the dish rag still over his shoulder. Tears were running down his face, and he made no move to wipe them. Roach stood near the front gate with his massive arms at his sides and his head bowed. Stitch was leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, one hand pressed flat over his chest like he was checking whether his heart was still beating. Harlow stood apart, arms crossed, jaw working, and the expression on his face was the one that Curtis had never seen before. The look of a man whose math has failed him and who has discovered, possibly for the first time, that some equations can't be solved with numbers. Lena was sitting at the workbench with her hands on the keyboard, frozen, staring at the boy on the stool, and Curtis could see it in her face. The fracture. The moment when the professional armor falls away, and what's left is just a 27-year-old woman looking at a 14-year-old boy and seeing every version of herself that she'd tried to bury. The girl who held her mother's hand alone. The daughter who needed her father and got silence instead. The child who grew up inside a system that didn't see her because the person who was supposed to fight for her had already left. Curtis looked at his daughter. Lena looked at her father. And in that look, that single, unguarded, devastating second of eye contact, something broke open between them that had been sealed shut for 6 years. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Something smaller and more honest than either. Just acknowledgement. Just the raw, wordless admission that they had both been damaged by the same absence and neither of them knew how to fix it. And maybe that was okay, because maybe fixing wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just being in the same room when it mattered. Curtis looked away first. He always did. "Upload it," he said to Rachel. "Everywhere?" "Everywhere." Rachel connected her laptop to the garage's Wi-Fi. Spotty, slow, Roach's jury-rigged setup that ran through a repeater bolted to the roof, and began uploading. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, her Substack, 3 journalist group chats, 2 civil rights organizations, the State Press Association listserv, every platform, every channel, every crack in the wall where a story could slip through. The first upload completed at 11:43 a.m. By noon, it had 400 views. By 12:30, 2,000. By 1 p.m., the Lincoln CBS affiliate had called Rachel's phone. A reporter from the Omaha World Herald had emailed. Someone at the state attorney general's office had left a voicemail. By 1:15, the video had 12,000 views and the comment section was on fire. By 1:30, Dalton Rusk's office issued a statement calling the video defamatory fabrications by disgruntled individuals with criminal histories, and announced that the county was pursuing legal action. By 1:45, 3 lawyers had contacted Rachel offering pro bono representation. And at 1:52 p.m., 8 minutes before the CPS deadline, Curtis's phone rang. Unknown number, different from before. He answered. "Mr. Vale, this is Special Agent Teresa Marsh with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit in Omaha. I've just watched a very interesting video. I'd like to talk." Curtis closed his eyes. The relief hit him like a wave, physical, overwhelming, the kind that makes the knees weak and the hands shake and the chest fill with something that has no name but feels like the opposite of drowning. "We're at 1847 Industrial Road," he said. "Harlan, Nebraska. CPS is about to walk through our door. If you want this evidence intact, you might want to get here first." "I'm already in the car," she said. 45 minutes. She hung up. Curtis looked at the clock. 1:53 p.m. 7 minutes. CPS was coming in 7 minutes and the FBI was 45 minutes away, which meant there was a gap. A 38-minute window where everything they'd built could be dismantled by a caseworker with a clipboard and a county order. "Roach," Curtis said. "Yeah." "Lock the gate." "It's locked." "Lock it again." Roach moved. Pike moved with him without being asked, the big Lakota man flowing from his corner toward the front of the garage with the silent, purposeful grace of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. At 1:58 p.m., a white county van pulled up to the gate. 2 CPS workers and a sheriff's deputy. They buzzed the intercom. Roach answered. Words were exchanged. Curtis couldn't hear them from inside the garage, but he could read the body language. The CPS workers wanted in. Roach was a wall. Curtis walked to the gate. The afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in 3 days, throwing long shadows across the snow-covered yard. The light was cold and sharp and had the quality of a searchlight, exposing everything, warming nothing. The lead CPS worker was a woman in her 50s with a county ID badge and a manila folder and the exhausted expression of someone doing a job she no longer believed in. "Mr. Vale, we have an emergency custody order for Elias Mercer." "I understand." "We need to come in and take the minor into custody." "I understand that too." "Then step aside." "Ma'am?" Curtis's voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man standing on the edge of a cliff and choosing his words like footholds. "I have reason to believe that returning Elias Mercer to state custody through Harlan County channels will place him in immediate danger. The group home he was placed in is operated by a company with direct financial ties to the man who framed his father. The county official who signed this custody order sits on the board that oversees that company. And approximately 40 minutes ago, I received a call from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit indicating that a federal investigation into these connections is now active. The CPS worker stared at him, the manila folder lowered half an inch. "I'm not obstructing," Curtis said. "I'm asking you to wait. 40 minutes, that's all. A federal agent is en route. When she arrives, the boy goes wherever the law says he goes. But I'm asking you, not as a biker, not as a troublemaker, not as whatever Dalton Rusk told you I am. I'm asking you as a man who is trying to keep a child safe. Please, wait." The deputy behind the CPS workers shifted. His hand moved toward his belt, not his weapon, his radio. The gesture of a man preparing to call for backup. The CPS worker looked at Curtis, then at Roach, then at the garage behind them, where through the open bay door she could see the Harleys and the workbench and the buzzing fluorescents and a 14-year-old boy standing in the center of it all with a piece of paper pressed against his chest and a room full of scarred men standing around him like a wall made of leather and loss. She looked back at Curtis. 40 minutes, she said. The deputy's hand dropped. Curtis exhaled. Inside the garage, Lena was on the phone with one of the pro bono lawyers, walking through the evidence at a pace that would have been impressive from a trained attorney and was staggering from a self-taught 27-year-old who'd learned litigation strategy the same way she'd learned everything else, alone, at night, because nobody was coming to help. Stitch was in the back room on his phone with Mama Jean. The Grand Island contact had come through. A family court judge named Evelyn Park, independent, no connections to Cornerstone or the county board. She'd agreed to review the case files. She'd also made a call to the Grand Island group home. Maya Chen was still there. Stitch relayed the information to Curtis. Judge Park says the girl is physically safe, for now. But her caseworker was replaced 3 months ago, and her file was flagged for transfer back to Harlan County. Back to Harlan? Back to Cornerstone. Back to Rusk's territory. Curtis felt the noose tighten. The machine was still running. Even now, even with the video exploding across the internet and the FBI on its way and the walls closing in on Rusk from every direction, even now the system was still trying to pull children back into its gears. Tell the judge we're sending everything we have, Curtis said. Lena, copy the files, all of them. Send them to Judge Park, to the FBI agent, and to Rachel. Already done, Lena said, without looking up from her phone. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Curtis Vale's life. He stood at the front gate with Roach and Pike, watching the county van idling on the road, watching the CPS workers standing in the cold, watching the deputy talk into his radio with increasing frustration. He could see more vehicles arriving in the distance. A news van from Lincoln, a sedan that might have been press or might have been county lawyers or might have been anyone. The road that had been empty for 3 days was suddenly alive. The video had crossed 50,000 views. Rachel's phone wouldn't stop ringing. At 2:31 p.m., a black SUV with federal plates turned off Route 9 and rolled down the access road toward the garage. It passed the county van, past the news vehicle, past the gathering crowd of onlookers who had materialized the way people always do when they sense something important happening in a place where nothing important ever happens. Special Agent Teresa Marsh stepped out. She was mid-40s, compact, with short black hair and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who had spent 20 years in federal law enforcement and had long since stopped being impressed by anything except evidence. She wore a dark overcoat, flat shoes, no badge visible, and carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had been through as many fights as Curtis's Harley. She walked directly to Curtis. Mr. Vale. Agent Marsh, though. Where's the boy? Inside. Where's the evidence? Inside. Printed, digital. 3 copies in 3 locations. Something moved across Marsh's face. Not surprise, but the closest thing to approval that a federal agent allows herself during an active operation. Good, she said. Let's go inside. She turned to the CPS workers. This location is now part of an active federal investigation. The emergency custody order is suspended pending review. If you have questions, contact the U.S. Attorney's Office in Omaha. Here's my card. The lead CPS worker took the card. Her face showed something that might have been relief. The deputy got back in his car. Marsh walked into the garage. She stopped in the center of the bay and looked around. At the Harleys, at the workbench, at the stained concrete, and the buzzing lights, and the men in leather who stood along the walls like sentries. She looked at Lena at the laptop. She looked at Rachel with her cameras. She looked at Elias on the stool with his diagram. All right, she said. Show me everything. Lena showed her everything. It took an hour. Marsh asked questions that were precise, technical, and occasionally devastating. She photographed documents. She took the USB drive into evidence. She recorded a preliminary statement from Elias with a federal recorder and a calm, professional warmth that made the boy's shoulders drop 2 inches from the tension they'd been carrying. At 3:45 p.m., Marsh made a phone call. She stepped outside. She was gone for 11 minutes. When she came back, her expression had changed, tighter, more focused, the look of someone who has just received authorization to do something significant. We're opening a formal investigation, she said. Public corruption, wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and based on the evidence regarding the children's facilities, potential federal charges related to the exploitation of minors in state care. The room was silent. I'm going to need all of you to make formal statements. Tonight. I have a team coming from Omaha. She looked at Curtis. And I'm going to need the boy to stay here. Under your protection. For now. Curtis looked at Elias. Elias looked back. For now, Curtis said. But they all knew. Everyone in that garage, every scarred, broken, stubborn man who had voted to protect a boy they barely knew. They all knew that for now was already permanent. That the moment they opened that gate and let the kid walk in from the snow, the decision had been made. Not by a vote. Not by a motion. by something older than procedure and stronger than bylaws, by the simple, terrible, irreversible act of giving a damn. At 4:12 p.m., while Marsh was setting up in the back room for formal interviews, Lena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, her face changed. "Curtis?" He crossed the room. "The video just hit the statewide news aggregate. It's on 3 network affiliates. Someone at the AP picked it up." She scrolled. "And, Curtis, someone in the comments posted a link, a second video, uploaded 20 minutes ago." She tapped the link. The video was shaky, poor lighting, shot on a phone in what looked like a bathroom. A girl's face filled the screen. 13, maybe 14. Dark hair, dark eyes, sharp features, and the same look Elias carried. The look of a child who had been through the machinery and come out the other side with evidence instead of surrender. "My name is Maya Chen," the girl said. "I live in a group home in Grand Island, Nebraska, operated by Cornerstone Youth Services. I saw Elias Mercer's video. He's telling the truth. I have proof. I kept records. I hid them where they couldn't find them, and I'm not going to be quiet anymore." The video cut out. Elias was standing behind Curtis. He'd seen the screen. His face had gone white. Not with fear, but with something beyond it, something that looked like the first crack of dawn after the longest night. "She's alive," he whispered. "She's alive," Curtis said. "She's fighting." "She's fighting!" Elias pressed the diagram against his chest and closed his eyes. His lips moved. No sound came out. Not a word. Just the involuntary motion of a boy trying to hold something so big inside his body that the only way to contain it was to close every opening and let the pressure build until it either broke him or remade him. Curtis put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He didn't squeeze. He didn't pull him close. He just rested his hand there, the weight of a scarred palm on a thin shoulder, and held it steady. Outside, the sun was going down. The sky had turned from cold steel to deep amber along the western horizon, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph of itself. The snow on the ground caught the gold and threw it back, and for a few minutes the world looked almost warm. The Harleys sat in their row along the garage wall, chrome catching the last light, engines cold but ready. And on the highway, moving fast now, a convoy of vehicles, federal SUVs, press cars, 2 state police cruisers, headed north toward Harlan, Nebraska, toward a corrugated steel building behind a chain-link fence where a 14-year-old boy had just changed the trajectory of a war by doing the only thing that the machine couldn't account for. He told the truth, and someone listened. But 14 miles south, in a county office building that was emptying fast as staffers read the news on their phones and began the quiet, panicked calculation of self-preservation, Dalton Rusk sat alone at his desk. The Mercer, contingency file was open in front of him. His phone was ringing. He wasn't answering. The screen of his computer showed the video, Elias's face, the diagrams, the garage, looping on autoplay, and Rusk watched it with the expression of a man watching a building he built begin to collapse from the inside, floor by floor, beam by beam, in the exact sequence of failure he had designed into someone else's structure, but never imagined in his own. He picked up his desk phone. He dialed one number. "It's Rusk," he said. "The relay station on County Road 12. Meet me there. Tonight. Bring everything from the secondary office. Files, hard drives. All of it." He hung up. Then he opened his desk drawer, took out a set of keys, and walked out of his office for the last time. The building was dark behind him, and 20 miles north, in a garage that smelled like diesel and coffee, and the collective weight of broken men who had decided to stop being broken long enough to protect something worth protecting, Curtis Vale's phone lit up with a notification from Harlow. One line. Rusk just left his office, heading south. County Road 12. He's running. Curtis looked at Roach. Roach looked at Pike. Pike was already reaching for his helmet. The Harleys started one by one, each engine catching with a deep, rolling thunder that shook the windows and rattled the tools on the walls and filled the garage with the sound that had defined these men for decades. The sound of machines built to move, ridden by men who had nowhere left to go except forward. Curtis swung his leg over the seat of his 2003 Road King. The leather was cold. The handlebars were cold. Everything was cold except the engine, which rumbled beneath him with a heat that felt like a heartbeat. He looked at Elias standing in the bay door, the diagram still against his chest, those pale eyes catching the last amber light of the dying day. "Stay here," Curtis said. "Come back," Elias said. Curtis didn't answer. He pulled his helmet on, kicked the stand, and rolled forward into the frozen dusk. Behind him, one by one, the Steel Reapers followed. Roach, Pike, Stitch, Harlow, Dex, Mooney, Briggs. 8 Harleys in formation, headlights cutting the dark, exhaust clouds rising white against the black sky, engines echoing through the frozen valley like the sound of something ancient waking up. They rode south on Route 9, toward County Road 12, toward the relay station, toward Dalton Rusk, and whatever waited at the end of the longest night any of them had ever known. And behind them, in the garage doorway, Elias Mercer watched the taillights disappear into the dark and held his father's diagram against his chest and did not move until the last sound of the last engine faded into the silence of the winter night. And then he whispered one word into the empty air, a word that was not a name and not a request, but something closer to a vow, spoken by a boy who had learned that the only thing more dangerous than the truth is the moment right before it lands. Please. The relay station sat at the end of County Road 12, like something the world had forgotten to demolish. A squat concrete building surrounded by rusted chain link, 3 transmission towers rising behind it against the black sky like the skeletons of giants. The parking lot was cracked asphalt under 6 inches of frozen slush, and a single sodium light mounted above the entrance door threw a sick yellow cone that made everything beneath it look jaundiced and dying. Beyond the fence, flat Nebraska farmland stretched to the horizon in every direction, empty, frozen, black under a sky with no moon and too many stars. Rusk's county truck was parked at the side entrance, engine off, lights off, fresh tire tracks cutting through the snow to the door, which stood open 6 inches, light leaking from inside. Curtis killed his engine 50 yards out. The other Harleys followed, 8 machines going silent in sequence, the absence of sound rushing in like water filling a vacuum. The quiet was enormous. The cold was worse. 23 degrees and dropping, the wind cutting across the open plain with nothing to stop it for 100 miles. He dismounted. The snow crunched beneath his boots. Behind him, Roach and Pike flanked left. Stitch and Harlow flanked right. Dex, Mooney, and Briggs held the road, engines idling low, headlights painting long beams across the frozen ground. Curtis walked toward the door. He didn't hurry. He didn't creep. He walked the way a man walks when he has spent 3 days awake and 2 decades running from something and has finally, irreversibly, turned around to face it. His breath came out in white plumes that dissolved into the dark. His hands were bare. His vest was open. The cold bit into his chest and he let it because the cold was the only thing that felt honest. He pushed the door open. The relay station's interior was one large room. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, industrial shelving along both sides filled with electrical equipment in various states of obsolescence. Banks of circuit breakers lined the back wall. Emergency lighting strips along the ceiling threw everything into harsh, colorless fluorescence that turned skin gray and shadows sharp. Dalton Rusk was in the center of the room. He was kneeling beside an open file box, feeding documents into a portable shredder that whined and chewed with a mechanical hunger. 3 other boxes were stacked beside him, lids off, contents half emptied. A laptop sat open on the concrete floor nearby, its screen showing a progress bar. Files being deleted, one by one, the digital equivalent of the paper being destroyed. Rusk looked up when the door opened. He was 56. Tall, once athletic, now carrying the soft weight of a man who spent his days behind a desk and his evenings at country club dinners where the drinks were free and the deals were made between the appetizer and the entree. His face was handsome in a faded way. Strong jaw, clean-shaven, blue eyes that had the particular quality of looking warm while calculating cost. He wore a dark overcoat over a button-down shirt and slacks, dress shoes soaked with snow. He did not look like a man destroying evidence. He looked like a man cleaning his office after hours. That was the thing about Dalton Rusk. He always looked like exactly what he wanted you to see. Until now. Now, in the fluorescent glare of an abandoned relay station at 9 o'clock at night, his hands full of shredded paper and his face caught between the laptop and the door, he looked like what he was. A man standing in the wreckage of his own machine, trying to erase the blueprints before anyone else could read them. Curtis stopped 10 feet away. Rusk stopped feeding the shredder. The two men looked at each other. 20 years since they'd been in the same room. 20 years since Rusk had turned in his patch and walked out of the Steel Reapers and into the clean, quiet world of city government where the violence was done with permits instead of fists, and the victims never saw the hand that hit them. "Curtis," Rusk said. His voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had spent decades managing rooms and reading people and always, always staying 3 moves ahead. "Dalton, you shouldn't be here." And yet, Rusk looked past Curtis at the doorway, where Roach's massive shadow filled the frame, then at the window, where Pike's silhouette was visible against the sodium light. He assessed, calculated, the blue eyes moving with the quick, mechanical precision of a man running numbers. "You're making a mistake," Rusk said. "Whatever that kid told you, whatever Lena dug up, it's circumstantial. It won't hold. I have lawyers who will shred this in discovery before it ever sees a courtroom." "The FBI is at my garage right now," Curtis said. Something shifted in Rusk's face. Microscopic. A tightening around the eyes that lasted half a second before the mask reassembled. But Curtis saw it. After 20 years of reading men's faces across poker tables and negotiation rooms and the hoods of broken-down cars, he saw it. Fear. "That changes the timeline," Rusk said, his voice still measured but fractionally faster now, the words coming with a precision that betrayed the effort behind them. "It doesn't change the math. Federal investigations take years. Indictments take longer. Convictions are rare. And in the meantime, I have resources you can't imagine." "You used my wife's name." The room went silent. The shredder stopped. Rusk's hand, still holding a sheet of paper, went still. His eyes met Curtis's, and for the first time, the very first time, the mask didn't just crack. It dropped. Not into fear, not into guilt, into something that Curtis hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. Recognition. The look of one broken man seeing another. "Sarah was already gone," Rusk said quietly. "She was in hospice. She couldn't sign anything. She wouldn't have known." "That's your defense?" "That's the truth." "The truth." Curtis's voice came out low and rough, scraped raw. "You stole a dying woman's identity to build a shell company that takes money meant for children. You sat on a board that was supposed to protect kids in care, and you used it as a profit center. You framed a man, a good man, a man who fixed your pipes and wired your buildings and never asked for anything. You framed him and put him in prison so you could burn the evidence of your own corruption. And when his 14-year-old son came looking for help, you sent people to steal his belongings and tried to bury him in the same system you built to protect yourself." Curtis took one step forward. "And you did all of it using the name of a woman I loved, a woman who spent her last months in a hospital bed while her daughter held her hand alone because I was too broken to be in the room. You took the one thing I had left of her name, her identity, the fact that she existed, and you turned it into a line on a corporate filing." Rusk stood up slowly. The shredded paper drifted to the floor around his feet like dead leaves. "I needed a clean identity," he said. "Someone with no business history, no flags. Sarah fit the profile. It was nothing personal." "Nothing personal." "Business, Curtis. That's all it ever was." Curtis stared at him. The distance between them was 8 feet. Close enough to see the pulse in Rusk's throat. Close enough to see the fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the cold. Close enough to close the gap in 2 steps and do the thing that every cell in Curtis Vale's body was screaming at him to do. His fists were clenched. His arms were shaking. The veins in his forearms stood out like cables. Roach's voice came from the doorway. Low, steady. The voice of a man who knew his president better than anyone alive. "Curtis." One word. That was all. Curtis breathed in, out. The rage didn't disappear. It sank. Down through his chest, down through his gut, down into the concrete beneath his boots, where it joined every other fury he had ever swallowed and would carry for the rest of his life. The rage became weight, The wait became stillness. The stillness became choice. He unclenched his fists. "You're not worth it," he said. Not with contempt, not with pity. With the flat, exhausted honesty of a man who has just realized that the thing he wanted most would cost him the thing he needed most. His freedom, his club, his ability to stand in front of a 14-year-old boy and say, "I did this the right way." Curtis turned to Roach. "Call Marsh, give her the location. Tell her he's here and he's destroying evidence." Roach was already dialing. Curtis looked back at Rusk. The man was standing in the center of the relay station with shredded paper at his feet and a laptop deleting files behind him, and the entire architecture of his life collapsing in real time. And his face had settled into something that might have been resignation or might have been the particular numbness of a man who has run out of moves and hasn't yet accepted that the game is over. "You could have walked away," Curtis said. 20 years ago, you could have just walked away and been decent." Rusk didn't answer. "Tom Mercer could be home right now. His kid could be in school. My wife's name could just be a name on a headstone that her daughter visits on Sundays. All of that could have been different. All you had to do was not be this." Rusk's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse, not quite, but the shadow of it. The awareness that the man in front of him was right, and that the awareness changed nothing, because the choices were already made, and the consequences were already in motion, and the only thing left was the waiting. "They'll offer me a deal," Rusk said. "Maybe. I have information they want, names, account numbers, people above me. Maybe. I won't do real time." Curtis looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Tom Mercer did 3 years," Curtis said over his shoulder. "Real time. For something you did. So whatever deal they offer you, I hope it keeps you up at night." He walked out into the cold. The federal vehicles arrived 14 minutes later. 3 SUVs and a forensic van. Marsh was in the lead car. She stepped out, assessed the scene, and walked into the relay station without a word to Curtis. 2 agents followed. The shredder was seized. The laptop was seized. The file boxes, including the ones Rusk hadn't finished destroying, were loaded into evidence bags. Rusk came out in handcuffs at 9:47 p.m. He walked between 2 agents with his head up and his face blank and his dress shoes dark with snow. He didn't look at Curtis. He didn't look at the bikers lined up along the road, 8 Harleys idling in the dark, exhaust rising white against the black sky. He looked straight ahead with the fixed, empty stare of a man who has already begun rehearsing his testimony in his head. The federal SUV pulled away. The taillights disappeared down County Road 12. And it was over. Not clean. Not fast. Not the way it happens in movies where the villain falls and the music swells and everyone knows exactly how to feel. It was messy and cold and anticlimactic in the way that justice always is when it finally arrives. Not with a bang, but with paperwork, with handcuffs that click instead of clang, with a man walking to a car in wet shoes while the people he damaged stand in the dark and try to figure out what to do with the silence that comes after. Curtis sat on his Harley in the parking lot of the relay station and smoked a cigarette and stared at the empty road. Roach sat beside him on his own bike. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "You didn't hit him," Roach said finally. "No." "Wanted to." "Yeah." "Why didn't you?" Curtis exhaled smoke into the frozen air. It curled upward and dissolved like everything does. "Because Elias told me to come back," he said. "And I can't come back from behind bars." Roach nodded slowly. The nod of a man who understood that the hardest battles aren't the ones you fight, but the ones you walk away from with your fists still clenched and your dignity intact. They rode home. The garage lights were on. All of them. Every fluorescent tube buzzing at full power, throwing the building into a warm, industrial glow that was visible from half a mile away. The gate was open. The yard was full of vehicles. Marsh's federal SUV, Rachel's Subaru, 3 other cars that Curtis didn't recognize. People moving inside. Elias was standing in the bay door. He hadn't moved. 5 hours. He had stood in that doorway for 5 hours, watching the road, holding his diagram, waiting. Curtis pulled into the yard and killed the engine. The silence rushed in. He swung off the bike, and his knees almost buckled. 53 years old, 3 days without real sleep, the adrenaline crashing out of his system like a tide pulling back to expose everything it had been hiding. He walked to the bay door. Elias looked up at him. "He's gone," Curtis said. The boy's face did something that Curtis would remember for the rest of his life. It didn't crumple. It didn't light up. It shifted, slowly, tectonically, like a landscape changing after an earthquake. The tension in his jaw released first, then his shoulders dropped, then his hands, those trembling, grease-stained 14-year-old hands that had rebuilt generators and carried diagrams and held the weight of a broken system for 3 years, opened. The diagram unfolded from his grip and hung at his side, and for the first time since Curtis had met him, Elias Mercer's hands were still, completely still. "My dad?" Elias asked. "I don't know yet, but Marsh said the case is being reviewed. Federal level. The evidence is strong." Curtis paused. "It's going to take time." Elias nodded. He didn't ask how much time. He was 14. He'd already learned that time was the currency the system charged for everything, and the one thing it never gave back. "Okay," Elias said. Curtis put his hand on the boy's shoulder. The same gesture as before, palm down, steady, not pulling close, not pushing away, just present, the weight of contact, the simplest and most difficult thing one human being can offer another. Elias didn't flinch. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early February, the gates of Tecumseh State Correctional opened at 10:14 a.m. The sun was pale and low, throwing long shadows across the frozen parking lot. The sky was the color of old paper. Not warm, not cold, just there, the way Nebraska sky is in winter, patient and indifferent and enormous. Tom Mercer walked out. He was 44. He looked 60. Prison had hollowed him the way water hollows stone, slowly, thoroughly, taking everything soft and leaving only the hard edges. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His face was gaunt. His hands, which had once wired buildings and fixed machines and held his son on his shoulders at county fairs, were thin and scarred from 3 years of institutional labor. He wore the clothes he'd been arrested in: khaki pants, a flannel shirt, a canvas jacket that no longer fit because prison had taken 30 pounds off his frame. He carried a clear plastic bag containing his personal effects: a wallet with $7 and an expired driver's license, a watch with a dead battery, and a photograph of a boy at age 11 holding a wrench and smiling. He stopped outside the gate and blinked at the sunlight. The cold air hit his face and he breathed it in, deep, slow, the breath of a man tasting freedom for the first time and finding it sharper and sweeter and more painful than he remembered. The road in front of the prison was lined with motorcycles, 14 Harleys. Not just the Harlan chapter, members from Lincoln, from Omaha, from Grand Island. Men who had heard the story and ridden through the cold to stand in a parking lot and say, with their presence and their engines and their silence, "We see you. We know what happened to you. You are not invisible." Elias stood at the front of the line. He was wearing a leather jacket, Curtis's old one, the one that had hung on a hook in the garage for years because Curtis had outgrown it and never thrown it away. It was 3 sizes too big on the boy. The sleeves hung past his wrists. The hem hit mid-thigh. He looked like a kid playing dress-up, which was exactly what he was. Except the costume was real, and the game wasn't a game, and the man walking toward him was his father. And 3 years is a long time when you're 14, and an eternity when you're 11. Tom Mercer saw his son and stopped walking. The distance between them was 40 feet, 30, 20. Elias didn't run. He walked, steady, measured, in the oversized boots and the oversized jacket, holding nothing in his hands because the diagram was no longer in his pocket. It was in a federal evidence file, entered as Exhibit 14A, the document that had started the unraveling of Dalton Rusk's empire and the exoneration of the man who drew it. He walked until he was standing in front of his father. Tom Mercer looked down at his son. 3 years of letters that couldn't say what needed to be said. 3 years of collect calls that lasted 15 minutes and felt like 15 seconds. 3 years of lying in a cell at night and wondering if his boy was safe and knowing with the certainty that only a parent knows, that he wasn't. That the system he'd been swallowed by had swallowed his son too, and there was nothing he could do from behind concrete and wire except draw diagrams and hope. "You got big," Tom said. His voice cracked. "You got skinny," Elias said. Tom laughed. It came out broken, half sob, half sound, and he pulled his son into his arms and held him the way you hold something that was lost and found and might still be taken, with both hands and all your strength and the full weight of every day you spent without it. Elias held on, the leather jacket bunched up around his shoulders. His face was pressed against his father's chest. His eyes were closed. His hands gripped the back of his father's canvas jacket so hard the fabric wrinkled and bunched, and still he didn't let go. The bikers didn't move, didn't speak, didn't rev their engines or raise their fists or do any of the dramatic things that people imagine when they think about motorcycle clubs. They just stood beside their machines in the pale winter sunlight and watched a father hold his son. And if some of them wiped their eyes with the backs of their gloved hands, nobody mentioned it, because there are moments that belong to silence, and this was one of them. Curtis stood beside his Harley at the end of the line. His hands were in his vest pockets. His face was still and calm and revealed nothing to anyone who didn't know him. Lena stood beside him, not close, not touching, 6 inches of frozen air between her shoulder and his. The same distance they'd maintained for 3 weeks. Present but not reconciled, working but not healed, in the same room but not yet in the same conversation about the things that mattered most. "You okay?" she asked without looking at him. "No." "Good." The ghost of a smile crossed her face. Curtis saw it from the corner of his eye and felt something shift in the ice shelf that had formed between them. Not a thaw, not yet, just a crack, the kind that lets a little light through. "Lena?" "Yeah. I'm sorry." She was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the parking lot and pushed her hair across her forehead, and she didn't brush it back. "I know," she said. "That's not the same as accepting it." "No, it's not." She paused. "But it's a start." She looked at him. He looked at her. And the thing that passed between them was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was a destination still far down a road they hadn't begun to travel. But permission. Permission to try. Permission to fail. Permission to be imperfect and present and flawed and still, somehow, worth the effort of showing up. Curtis nodded once. Lena nodded once. Then they both looked forward, at the father and son still holding each other in the parking lot of a state prison on a cold Tuesday in February, and said nothing else because nothing else needed to be said. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were not a swift, clean narrative of healing and redemption set to swelling music. They were slow and difficult and full of the kind of unglamorous, exhausting work that real recovery demands. Tom Mercer moved into the back room at the garage, while Mama Jean worked on getting his apartment lease reinstated. He slept on the same army cot his son had slept on. He woke up at 4 a.m. every morning because prison had rewired his circadian rhythm, and the freedom to sleep late felt more disorienting than the restriction ever had. He drank coffee at the workbench and stared at the wall and sometimes didn't speak for hours, and nobody pushed him, because every man in that garage understood that silence after confinement is not absence, it's decompression. Elias enrolled for his GED, not at a school. The traditional classroom had never worked for him, the words tangling on the page like knotted wire. Instead, Lena set up a laptop in the corner of the garage with a text-to-speech program and a series of online courses designed for visual learners. The boy sat there every afternoon after his shift in the shop, headphones on, absorbing information through his ears while his hands stayed busy with whatever engine or circuit was on the workbench in front of him. He learned the way he'd always learned. Through systems, through patterns, through the logic of things that fit together. Stitch checked his feet every week. The frostbite healed clean, no permanent damage. The medic said it was luck. Curtis said it was stubbornness. Elias said nothing because he was already focused on the next thing, which was how he had always survived, by moving forward, by solving the next problem, by not looking back at the distance he'd covered barefoot in the dark. Maya Chen was transferred from Grand Island to a foster placement in Lincoln, a real one, vetted by Judge Park and monitored by a caseworker from outside the county system. She and Elias talked on the phone every Tuesday and Thursday night. Curtis sometimes heard the conversations through the thin wall of the back room. Two teenagers speaking in the careful, coded language of survivors, trading information and silence in equal measure, building something between them that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite more, but was rooted in the absolute certainty that the other person understood. Cornerstone Youth Services was dissolved by state order in March. 7 staff members were charged. Dalton Rusk's cooperation with federal investigators, the deal he'd predicted, the names and account numbers he'd traded for a reduced sentence, brought down 2 state-level officials and a construction company CEO. Rusk pled guilty to 12 counts, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for June. The eminent domain filing on the garage was withdrawn. The veterans' rally permits were reinstated. And on a Saturday evening in late March, when the snow had finally begun to melt and the first raw smell of spring was pushing through the frozen ground, Curtis Vale walked into his garage and found Elias alone at the workbench, rebuilding a carburetor under the soft yellow glow of the desk lamp. The boy looked up. He looked different now. Still thin, still sharp-boned, but the hollowness in his cheeks had filled slightly, and the dark circles beneath his eyes had faded from purple to pale shadow. He was wearing a clean shirt. His hands were still black with grease. Some things don't change. Some things shouldn't. Curtis sat down across from him. He didn't say anything for a while. He watched the boy work. The quiet precision of his fingers, the concentration in those pale gray eyes, the way he turned each component over and studied it before placing it exactly where it needed to go. "How'd you learn to see it?" Curtis asked. "The systems, the patterns. How'd you learn to see what nobody else notices?" Elias didn't look up from the carburetor. His hands kept moving and steady, sure, fitting pieces together with the patient certainty of someone who knows that every broken thing has an order underneath the damage. "Most things aren't broken," he said softly. "People just stop trying to fix them." Curtis looked at the boy, at the carburetor, at the garage around them. The oil-stained concrete, the buzzing fluorescents, the Harleys along the far wall, the scarred oak table where 8 men had voted to protect a stranger and changed the trajectory of their own lives. He thought about Sarah, about her name, now cleared from the corporate filings, restored to what it should have always been, just a name on a headstone that Lena visited on Sundays, and Curtis was learning to visit too. He thought about Lena, about the Tuesday dinners they'd started, awkward, halting, full of long pauses and careful words, and the slow, painful, beautiful work of rebuilding something that was never going to look like what it was before but might, with enough patience and enough coffee and enough willingness to show up even when it hurt, become something new. He thought about Tom Mercer, asleep in the back room, dreaming whatever free men dream. He thought about the text message he'd sent to Rusk. "Come try." 2 words. The most reckless and the most necessary thing he'd ever done. Curtis stood up. He put his hand on Elias's shoulder, briefly, lightly, the way he always did, and walked toward the front of the garage. The bay door was open. The evening air was cold, but the edge was off it. The killing cold of January softened into something that merely bit instead of burned. Outside, the last light of the day was fading along the western horizon. The sky was deep amber at the bottom and purple at the top, and scattered with the first pale stars of evening. The snow on the ground was melting in patches, revealing dark earth beneath, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark was singing, the first one of the season, impossibly early, testing the air. Roach was in the yard, wiping down his Harley with a rag. Pike was leaning against the fence, silent, watching the sky. Dex was in the doorway of the kitchen, holding a mug of coffee with both hands, his 11 months of sobriety now 5 months longer and counting. Curtis lit a cigarette. The ember caught on the first strike. He inhaled, held it, exhaled slow. The smoke rose into the cold evening air and dissolved. Behind him, inside the garage, the sound of a carburetor being reassembled. The soft click of metal finding metal. The quiet, precise work of a boy who had learned that the world breaks things, and that broken things can be fixed, and that the fixing is what matters. Not the breaking, not the blame, not the years lost or the trust betrayed, or the distances between fathers and sons and daughters that sometimes feel as wide as the Nebraska plain. Just the fixing. Just the steady, patient, imperfect work of putting things back together. The garage lights burned warm against the coming dark. The Harleys gleamed in their row. And out on Route 9, heading north, the distant sound of an engine. Not coming, not going, just out there, somewhere in the enormous American night, moving through the cold toward whatever comes next. Curtis finished his cigarette. He went back inside.